Untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, events, politics, and more from across our disunited states of America and the increasingly divided, fragmented surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Good morning, everybody. Hope you're having a wonderful morning. And let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, there were more than 14,140 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. That's paired with about 189 new deaths. Those are both very low numbers relative to the averages recently. Over the past week, there's been an average of 25,318 cases per day. That is a decrease of 38% from the average 2 weeks earlier. I'll put it like this, 38%. That's close to 40%, which is relatively close to 50%. If you had a 50% decline every 2 weeks or months, you would be in a dramatically different state of play. You'd have far fewer numbers. Very quickly get to like 1/10 the level of COVID circulation. And we haven't been at 38% for months, but we've been in various states of decline in terms of the total number of COVID cases. And it's happening now faster than ever. I can't help but think that vaccines have something to do with it. Exciting. Anyway, back to the headline itself. 39% of the American public has been fully vaccinated, and 49% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected in the United States more than 33,137,000 people total, and killed about 589,500 people. Japan has opened mass COVID vaccination centers, and it's opening more this coming just 2 months before the start of the Olympics. And India's COVID death toll has passed 300,000, with the country's health ministry recording 4,454 new deaths from the coronavirus in the last 24 hours. In national news, the Biden administration and Republicans are still debating the extent of his infrastructure plan, with Biden dropping his numbers and Republicans slightly inching theirs upwards. It's gone down from, just over $2 trillion to $1.7 trillion for the infrastructure plan. In international news, a Ryanair passenger plane that had been en route from, two unrelated cities was forced to reroute to travel to Minsk in Belarus, specifically because there was a Belarusian dissident who was on board and taken into custody upon the plane's arrival. The owner of the airline has called this an act of piracy. Other outside officials have called it an act of hijacking. At the very least, it is an overuse or an apparent abuse of a president's power. We're going to be talking about this more in a few minutes, I'm sure. A UN nuclear watchdog has said that Iran has agreed to a 1-month extension of surveillance cameras that were installed in its nuclear facilities. The detained and deposed leader of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, appeared in person in court for the first time since her arrest and detention on February 1st earlier this year. Also in appearance was Win Myint, president of the previous government. There was reportedly fierce fighting in eastern Afghanistan and in the eastern Congo. 8 workers say that between 600 and 1,000 homes were destroyed by a volcano that went off. The lava rolling from it, the emissions, fell short of a city apparently. So a lot more lives were spared. And then from the UK, historic treasures were apparently stolen from Arundel Castle, including rosary beads given to Mary, Queen of Scots, that she took to her death. The total theft was worth over $1 billion, American dollars. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I'll start with the Belarusian one, because in some sense, that's one of the biggest, it's probably the biggest story this weekend in terms of a single story coming out. And I guess I was thinking about it this morning and yesterday, and what I realized was, without even noticing it, I was a little bit cautious of the whole Western narrative on it, just because it's going to be subtly anti-Russian, because Belarus is, usually associated with Russia. We often talk about them in relation with one another. They're clearly a sort of boundary state in between the EU and Russia, and Russia and the EU in its own way.
Strongman of Europe.
Yeah,
they call him.
26 years in power right now.
Yeah.
Lukashenko, exactly. And we're trying to wean it away from Russia pretty unsuccessfully.
Right.
We're trying to do the color revolution thing, and that did not work out in that case. Lukashenko was a little bit too strong of a strongman, I guess. And then Russia is doing what it's done for decades now, as far as I can tell, which is sort of cautiously trying to maintain some level of relationship with the country, while also, it's a strong man, much more of an authoritarian leader than Putin is, and I think that he's cautious of that kind of thing. And so, anyway, it leaves that country in a weird position. And so Lukashenko seems to have done more or less what he wanted in this sort of interesting, large post-Soviet state. And this has been the country riddled with protests since last year. It underwent an election in which Lukashenko seems to have cheated by pretty much all or most accounts.
Apparently he would have won anyway and still cheated.
Exactly.
It's like, was there a doubt? I mean, is that why? I mean, is it just to pad your numbers and make yourself look that much better? Like, look at the, massive amount of support that I have. Like, I may be a strong man, but I have public support. Is it that? I mean, because the moment that you do that, and the moment you take that step and cheat, well, it creates all sorts of skepticism with the result of the election, whether you won or not. It's like, you might not have, the alcohol might not have caused your DUI, but you had alcohol in your system regardless. And regardless of how you're engaged, it's going to be engaged with, well, the alcohol didn't cause my accident. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
In this case, it's like you cheated. Doesn't really matter whether or not you would have won or not. And how do we know you would have won? Like, it's those type of questions that come into play. I don't know what is in his head on that. Oftentimes threats are larger than the thing itself. And maybe he didn't know. I don't know. But it was a horrible idea. If you knew, or if you had a chance, or if you knew more likely than not that you were going to win, this was a horrible idea.
I hear you. Well, yeah, and you're talking about tampering the elections. That's been sort of defining the civil unrest and civil movements in the country and the international coverage of it since later last year. And then, as a part of that civil unrest, he's a strongman type figure. He's been arresting international journalists and certainly domestic journalists and domestic activists to an extreme. He's been doing a lot of that, and we've been hearing about it quite a bit. And then with this new sort of rerouting of the passenger plane, the Ryanair passenger plane, quote unquote hijacking, it's adding fuel to that story. Now, I don't know. The use of the word piracy feels a bit off to me, but I understand where people are going with it. And so I'm a little bit cautious about what exactly comes with that, because it's not like he, pillaged the contents of, of the passengers' wallets or whatever. He didn't, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's a slight extension of the word, but I get what people are saying. He forcibly rerouted the plane and then used
military
that
escort.
And I don't want to approve of that, because I certainly don't want the U.S. to do that kind of thing, which is sad, because it's the kind of thing that I could potentially see the U.S. doing. If there's a high-profile person like Assange, wouldn't we try to be...
We did do that.
Exactly. I was like, wait, didn't we do that? How
was it, Bolivia?
And we were trying to do that with
like that?
Snowden and the plane, from Hong Kong to... I forget where, to Russia, I think it was.
Because Snowden wasn't, if I remember correctly, wasn't originally trying to go to Russia or something like that. The plane got diverted or got pulled down.
Anyway, I wasn't trying to harp on the hypocrisy of it, although there could be some of that. But my real point was, I don't know if it's piracy exactly, but it happened, and it was. It's. I don't like it. I don't want to approve of that kind of thing, either by him or anybody else on the global stage. So
any government would do it. I'm not saying right, wrong.
If they had the power to do it,
yeah, they would do it. I mean, they wouldn't think twice about it. The international community can bellyache all they want.
Well, if the stakes are high enough, but I guess the feeling I get is it doesn't seem like the stakes with this one dude are that high. This almost seems like a show of force or something from Lukashenko.
Yeah,
you see what I'm saying? It's not like
I can do it just because I can do it.
Yeah, or something like that.
I don't know. I mean, sometimes these are people, and sometimes we think of the stuff that they should be higher than what their personal petty grievances will be in relation to, think of Khashoggi. I mean, Khashoggi, from the standpoint of the state, wasn't going to undermine the state of Saudi Arabia. He wasn't going to destroy and dismantle the state.
Because hadn't he been in their allies in different ways for years? Some parts of the family.
Exactly.
That's the thing with Khashoggi that always confused me, is that he had these friendly relations. It's probably much simpler, and but he had these friendly relationships with members of the Saudi family,
Right.
and then he at one point, and it seems like with some of them still probably, and then he kind of turned on them and started to get more critical coverage.
Like that there were members of the Saudi family that he backed over others.
Yes,
and the ones he backed lost. I mean, it's on some level is there, but even that. But that's kind of my point, right? Shogi at this point was in the United States, basically at the Washington Post, or at the very least writing for the Washington Post. And he goes to get his marriage certificate. He knows he's in danger. He goes anyway. He loves his wife or his girlfriend, and they chop him up and with a bone saw.
And then there's the theory. Why the hell did his girlfriend wait so long? He's inside getting a marriage certificate, and she's waiting for hours while her husband is being grievously disemboweled.
Yeah, I mean,
organized.
It's like, but what does she do? Like, if you're there, what do you do?
Yeah,
like, do you knock on the door? Do you bang on the door? And at some point, I think they said she knocked, and it was like, nobody's here. And he's like, what do you mean nobody's here? He went in. Yeah, sorry, there's nobody here. I mean, at this point, like, Turkey had the tape. Erdogan had the tape. Like, Erdogan knew about it. It was trying, like, it's so wild. I guess my point is the petty grievances was enough for Saudi Arabia to take that step. And if you remember the world outcry, everywhere we went around the globe, they talked about that story. Didn't matter the country we were in. Europe, Egypt, didn't matter. And that was the story. It's like, oh my God, they chopped the guy up. They chopped the guy up. And keep in mind, at this point, Saudi Arabia had been waging a brutal, vicious war in Yemen that we were basically backing. And so it's like, nobody cared about the war. Like, they were using starvation, they were using disease, weaponizing that stuff. And then Khashoggi gets chewed up with a bone saw. They were like, oh my God, I can't believe they did that.
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe they did that. That's unacceptable. It's like, but what about Yemen? Is Yemen not unacceptable? Like, it's so weird. It's almost as if the number of people, when you kill a huge number of people, that it's so diffuse. It's so
that is how that works.
Get your head around.
Of course.
Yeah. Whereas the individual, and it's like, oh, his wife, his girlfriend was waiting outside. It's like, oh, it hurts. Yeah.
Both to protect and to attack. Yeah, you're talking about this sort of, okay, how can you rally people around the defense of a single individual who you perceive as coming under threat? A single person, if it's a good enough story and the person is valued enough, a single person, their death can be worth millions or billions of deaths or whatever. There's some people that certain people specifically will be like, that's, they'll be more deeply affected by it than they would any large number on a sheet of statistics or whatever the case. But you can also use that to aggress against people. This is one of Saul Alinsky rules for radicals tactics, is that you want to freeze on a single person. You want to take a person, make that person your enemy, and make that person known as your enemy. Everybody, you're trying to sort of rally against that person, and it's the same idea. You're just trying to personalize it, whether for better or for worse. You know, but it's useful. That's how our brains work. We are meant to understand not the interactions between numbers, although we are adept at it, weirdly enough, but instead interpersonal relationships, what we should think and feel about other people, how they should think and feel about us, how we're going to relate to each other, and of course, you do that. You write that large enough for society. And that's how that works.
Yeah. I guess the weird part about that, for Saudi Arabia, there was no pushback in general. Like, the Khashoggi thing felt like it was in a bubble unto itself. Like, it wasn't like, for example, it wasn't like, all right, there's a Yemen war going, and there's opposition to the Yemen war. Khashoggi happens, and that's tethered to the Yemen war.
Well, because Khashoggi wrote for the Washington Post towards the end there, and he was a journalist, and I believe they're perceived usually as a protected class internationally, and thankfully, in a lot of cases, because some journalists do legitimately good work, and historically, of course, they're in a position where power often isn't going to like what they're saying wherever they are, whatever they're doing. If they're doing their job right, they're revealing what should be revealed, that kind of thing. The government's usually, if you're a good journalist, hopefully the government doesn't like you. But I don't know, maybe I'm missing something there. Anyway, there was more like you're saying, there's more perception of a connection with Khashoggi because he was writing for an American outlet and because he was a member of this sort of international class. Then if they'd been running on the news, details and facts about Yemen, we would have cared. I feel, if that had been what they were focusing on day in, day out, and that was what people were talking about in the street, and you're thinking about it, people have the capacity to imagine suffering and also great delight and all these things. We're people. I mean, we're pretty expansive people. It's just that what is provided to us, the information that's given to us, is so bandwidth limited. Yeah. It's so gated and biased that's how you control people.
It is how you control people. And what does that say about us as people then? That gets into the whole robot stuff. That people, yes, they believe they're thinking. Yes, they believe they're making conscious choices and decisions and everything else. But ultimately, what they're responding to is the information that is basically provided to them. They think on some level they're choosing. On some other level, they are not. It's being imposed.
Maybe, but for me,
that was a perfect example. The example that you gave, basically, look, if people were given the Vietnam War, the moment that the information about the Vietnam War became very clear to the public was against the war. Under normal circumstances, that's not the case. What happens if the media covered that war differently, though, as opposed to covering it critically? It's, you know what I mean? Like, the public itself is being pushed in various directions, massage, if you will.
That's how it works. But it's like a blind man in a dark room,
right?
And you're asking them to describe the room that they're in, and then if you selectively shine lights on certain things, you'll get a description. You can control what description you get.
Exactly.
But there's a room there, and the person that you're asking to describe that stuff has all of this stuff going on in their head about what's actually out in the room. But if you control the light, if you get to determine what they see, there are like these boundless possibilities that if you give people more than a latitude of space for thought and space for power, they'll pursue. And suddenly you'll get massive changes in society over the long run. People invent new things and they do new. My point is I don't want to diminish the capacity for humans to really reach their potential if they're given the opportunity to do so. And often when we see them doing that, it defies our expectations of determinism, free will, all the sort of philosophical things.
It's a different world.
If you get used to people being rote and robot-like, then it's easier to think that they are that way by default and that there's nothing, no difference between them and clocks at some point.
I don't think people are robots by default. And even in the context of a world where human beings are expansive things, that's still robotic on some level. I mean, there's still some bit of code there, some logic that's running within the context of the individual as it processes information and responds to its outside world. Even in the highest of aspirations, these kind of emancipatory worlds where humanity, if he wants to go to school, goes to school. If humanity wants to get to go to the doctor, he goes to the doctor. If they're working somewhere and all of a sudden he says, you know what? I think I want to be an astronaut now. They can go be an astronaut now because of information and everything else was provided to them. If we had that world where instead of the, 60, 70% making $10 an hour, that these guys have the capacity to extend themselves to the degree that they want, that's a different world. And by the way, that world is not radically inaccessible. I mean, 2 small changes. Allow people, get rid of poverty first, and allow people to go to school in the way that they go to school. There's still all sorts of issues that we will have to tackle and deal with. But at the very least, you allow this level of potential to be just unleashed. I mean,
I would.
You don't like the school thing, but you know what I mean? Just education in general.
There are a couple of things that keep me from getting too utopian about it. I think that there's enough to celebrate.
No, I'm a man. Be utopian.
I hear you. I hear you.
Emancipatory.
And I don't think that it's in the nature of people to ever stop pushing for a more functional society. And I think that people includes me. I think that if I were to live in a society that was dysfunctional, I'd want to try to improve it in different ways. But at the same time, I feel like it's healthy to try to reconcile myself with things that don't change about humans or about what it means to live in this world. Right. And there's something about I use the word human nature just to sort of step past it for a second. There's something about the way that we operate where we like to compete over scarce things.
Yes.
Whether it's our identity or material resources, we like to compete with each other over what we lack. Because by definition, you don't have as much of it. Now, you can get rid of material scarcity, but the kind of scarcity
like or need. I would say need.
I don't know, but if your identity is in the mix, if your identity is hanging from what you can achieve, if specifically it's tied to a positional value in society, if you need to be number one, well, if everybody's trying to be number one, you're inevitably going to get into an ego-based confrontation constantly, and people are going to start dying or whatever pretty quickly, and it's not going to, you get the idea. It kind of keeps going. And then the response to that would be, okay, but maybe you can remove the conditions in which people strive for those kinds of things and have them strive for lower things. But I'm not sure that's good or possible.
Yeah.
So
we have
I'm worried that
here.
some confrontation is inevitable, and if that confrontation is deep enough, it gets bloody, and then you suddenly have an imperfect society. So what do we do with that state of affairs?
I don't think there's any look, we are washed in all sorts of points of views and ideologies. And that stuff needs on some level balance out on some level, but it doesn't balance out, right? Because people are on some level different. They're raised differently. You're in different places and everything else. And what's weirder is you have all of these people, 300 million people, that all like massive landmass, and all of these people are still under this one religious or political religion of sorts. It's very interesting and very weird in the way that society kind of drags all of these people together despite the faction and the friction and everything else. I would say, no, I wouldn't necessarily get utopian about it. And to be fair, any sort of releasing pent-up potential is going to be chaotic just in general, because people are going to create things that are disruptive. I mean, for God's sake, the internet in and of itself is disruptive. And you're going to have people creating all sorts of systems, all sorts of ways of doing things. And on some level, the point is to not do that. Or to not have that. Meaning, on some level, society seeks to restrain that function with the point of trying to maintain an integrity in society itself.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't have to be that way. I would argue that on some level that gets to our economic system where it's like, well, the goal of this is to maximize profit. That means we need workers in order to behave, in which case we don't need people to be free thinkers working at McDonald's. We need those people to be robots working at McDonald's. In a different world where it's like, well, we just advance as we continue to advance. There is no end point. There's always just improvement. In that world, then yes, you have those people being emancipated at 5 years old. Like, yes, I want to change the world. And you have those people being creative, and you teach them to be creative, and you teach them how, because creativity is not necessarily something that's just magic. Sometimes those things can be taught, even though there may be different levels at which the individuals can express it.
Oh, but here's an idea, and we should probably go to a break just so we can get to monologue and soapbox stuff. But what if part of what you need for real creativity, imagination, and a sense of rebellion against society, all these things, what if you need in some level is like deep psychic pain? Now, do you want society to be in the role of administering deep psychic pain, or do you just want to sort of let nature work itself out?
Does it
need to be painful? Does childbirth need to come with the blood and the agony, or is there something about creating a life that maybe you don't need?
Well, I would say humanity doesn't, we don't get a free pass. I mean, in the way that we think. And even in a good world, there will still be difficulty and pain, right? Like there's no way out of it. There's still illness, there's still injury, you're still going to stump your toe. Those things still particularly happen. I do think we can lessen it, however. And I do think striving to lessen it is not necessarily a bad thing, especially if we have the capacity to do so.
But you know how fiction writers are sort of fixated on like dystopian societies pretty often?
Yeah.
Well, maybe it's just because that's like the society that they feel would be most artistically conducive. It's like, if I lived in that society, think about how much I could write. They would, at every turn, they would try to keep me from writing. Yeah. And they would also induce in me these feelings that I would have to express. So, I mean, those would probably be a really strong artistic society. So we need to imagine, yeah. we need to go to a break, which is why the role of government, the libertarians are right, the role of government is to spread misery, and it should keep doing that because it's good for the arts. We need to go to a break. We'll be back in a minute in our soapbox segment. I'm joined by Jamarl Thomas. I am Shane Stranahan, and you're listening to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So UFOs are in vogue. UFOs are in vogue. Now, I have been pushing this going back before it was in vogue. So seeing this is a little bit heady for me and a little bit weird. I have no idea why all of a sudden the U.S. government is pushing this, but I do know that this information is leaking out. The wild part about it is that all of these people, these outlets, all of a sudden have this voracious appetite for it. CBS News, 60 Minutes, Morning Joe, all of these outlets, publications, New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera, carrying all of this content. I was here first. It's great to see. It's a different world. Ever since the New York Times published its article talking about or outing the ATIP program, the world had fundamentally changed. Obama had been asked prior about this question of UFOs, but he's always deferred on it. But now you have DNI, Director of National Intelligence, Ratcliffe, coming out saying, yeah, we have loads of videos. You have 60 Minutes doing a piece where Elizondo comes out. And, of course, Elizondo was on the show with the best interview Elizondo has ever had. Elizondo ran, director of the program, ATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, that came out of OSAP. And Elizondo, when asked, says, yes, I don't believe it's us. I don't believe we have the capability to do what the craft are doing. We don't have the capability to create a ship that goes into all of these various mediums at these various phenomenal speeds, making these left turns and everything else. And this is not my opinion. This is not my point of view. This is scientific research. I ran the program. It was my job. And yes, I don't believe it's us. That's Elizondo. That was the guy who ran the program. Harry Reid saying he thought that they were even materials that were kept by one of the companies. You even had members of your military coming out. Ryan Graves saying, yes, we saw these things for months, invading our airspace, doing things that we just could not do. You had Commander Fravor and his wing woman coming out on 60 Minutes, the first time she ever came forward, basically saying, yes, I had no idea what he was. We followed it. We tracked it. It was a piece of technology. It seemed to be somewhat of a ship. It came out of the water. And the thing, after we started to line up on it, dropped and boom, gone. And ended up all of these miles away within a split second. This is what your personnel are saying. People who you're paying to defend this country, who are flying in these advanced machines. Even the most recent case for the USS Kidd, the Raphael, where in Omaha, where the videos were basically released and went all over the world saying, yes, these videos are real, coming from the Pentagon. All of this happened right away. And the question becomes, well, wait a minute. Are you saying something is flying through our military installations? Something is turning off our nuclear weapons? Something is going through our airspace and you can't touch it? You have no idea how it does what it does? And you didn't raise this with a certain degree of alarm? You aren't bothered by this? When Obama was asked, Obama came clean. And Obama said, yes, there's something invading our space in this particular way. We don't necessarily know what it is. Joe Biden is asked. Let's hear Biden. Let's play the clip.
If you're not asking me a mean one like you usually do.
It's something interesting, I think, that has not come up. President Obama says that there is footage and records of objects in the skies, these unidentified aerial phenomenon, and he says we don't know exactly what they are. What do you think that it is?
I would ask him again. Thank you. Come
That
on, Rob.
answer is radically unacceptable. Radically unacceptable. Think about what we're saying for the moment. You have Newt Gingrich recently, serial habitual womanizer, Newt Gingrich. Even he came out and gave this thoughtful commentary on the subject matter. All of these guys are talking about it like it's technology. All of these guys, especially the ones that have been briefed, have been very clear about what has been taking place. Lou Elizondo has just filed an IG complaint saying that the Department of Defense is basically lying in regards to the information that it's been putting out in regards to what it knows. Even if you don't believe, like I believe, that it's not us, there's still something that is going through our airspace. even if you believe that it is just another foreign actor around the world, then that seems to be more of a reason to care and be concerned, or for that matter, to have a certain level of hysterics that something has leapfrogged you by 20, 30, 40 years, despite the fact that you spend more than 20 other countries or 10 other countries on your nuclear weapons. It should concern you. Personally, I think the Department of Defense has not necessarily had hysteria about it because they know on some level that this is not necessarily a threat, that the technology that we're seeing is so wildly in advance of ours that they just give it on some level a pass. By the same token, that is almost irrelevant. If you believe for the moment that this is secret tech of our government that is a parallel track, even that is more of a reason for us to know about rogue tech. It is unacceptable for the President of the United States, given what we know as a flat fact that something is taking place, to dodge that question. That question should be asked, and the President of the United States should have a response. And whatever you think it is almost secondary to the fact that the President of the United States should be confronted with that question and should have a valid answer for that question. Shane, what are your thoughts on this? We're probably going to come back to it at some point later.
Continuing to think about it over the last couple of days, it seems more likely to me than ever that this is a U.S. project. The UFOs, the UAPs, the leaks and stuff that we're seeing are descriptions of U.S. technology. Because what are the alternatives? I'll start with aliens, I guess. The baseline level of likelihood of aliens, you know, I'm just going to be I'm going to roll to disbelief. I'm going to roll to be skeptical of aliens. The idea that it is other competitor governments, I feel like we would be handling this a bit differently. Now, if we take, for instance, if we assume that some of what we're seeing are like surveillance drones, extremely high-tech surveillance drones being sent over from China, the reason I don't necessarily buy that is I feel like that would have caused major and very public shockwaves in the American military establishment. Right. If at some point down the chain of information, it became known that the Chinese, who we outspend like crazy, managed to leapfrog us to that degree. I feel like that would have blown up somewhere, and we either would have heard about it or we would have seen visibly the signs of the Pentagon and the other, associated intelligence agencies.
Am I wearing you down on the otherworldly hypothesis?
No, because I think it's us.
Oh, you think it's us? I think it's secret tech engaging us?
Very possibly. One of the more likely things is that we are testing the tech on our own navies to check whether or not they can evade radar. And we would assume ourselves to be operating on roughly the same level as the Chinese. Yeah, it's just testing it. Well, can they see it? That kind of thing. That seems more likely to me now, or it could be aliens.
I do think we have tech. So I do think that, I think 20 years in advance, 30 years in advance, it's like, what does that look like? So I do think we have tech. And I wouldn't even be shocked if we had tech that could do just obscene amounts of speeds and whatnot. So I wouldn't be shocked by it. But is it the same thing that we're seeing, where we're seeing something that can go through space, water, and air like it's butter? There's just these
You say 4 decades. You said 40 years.
40 years, yeah.
That's like 400, man. That's so far ahead.
That's my point. It seems like they are being very chill about this in a way that, can you imagine if the Department of Defense found out that the Chinese government had access to a craft that could basically manipulate gravity to go left turns out of the blue? Well, are they chill with that?
No, you need to discover a new science and then implement it master a new technology.
Yeah.
In other words, what it's doing doesn't make sense to us.
Right.
We'd have to figure out how it does what it does. And then we'd have to not just develop it, but refine that and perfect that over the course of multiple generations of discovery. And that's decades. Yeah. That's decades of time spent,
And I think that's why they don't believe it's us.
Yeah.
That's where Rubio, Ratcliffe, all these other guys, because in their heads, they can't conceive of that being the case.
How do you know?
They could be wrong.
How do you know what's going on in their heads, though?
Well,
just from what they're saying?
Well, there are two things. There's what they're saying. There's stuff that's going on behind the scenes that people who are talking to them, like, for example, Dan Sheehan, Lou Alessandro's lawyer, and him coming back basically saying, look, the Department of Defense doesn't think it's a threat, which is why they didn't flip out. Meaning, Lou looked at it and said, oh, my God, there's something invading our space. That's his reaction.
Yeah,
his reaction was hysterics.
Again, that makes me feel like it's us. It would be so weird. Just think about that for a second. Unidentified technology that exceeds anything we're capable of. And they're like you were saying earlier, nah, guys, it's cool.
It's cool.
It's cool.
It's all right.
Don't worry. Don't mind it.
Yeah.
It's chill.
Yeah.
Everything's chill.
But if you didn't think it was a threat, though, let's say you took it as we can't touch it, we can't see it until it lets us see it. Like it's something that you just consider that's
in the
off the
horror
game
movie,
board. We don't even want to touch it or even think about it.
I'll put it like this: in the horror movie, when you have a ghost. And there's like the one character that's like, no, the ghost is okay.
Right.
The ghost hasn't hurt us so far. We've only lost 2 dogs, our house cat, and we suddenly have blood on our walls. But the ghost isn't. The ghost isn't a threat. They're the like dotty old person who is completely wrong. The ghost is a threat.
The ghost was problematic. Well, they also think if there was a contest, there was no contest. Like that's the other part. It's like. They're so wildly advanced.
Yeah, there isn't a threat because we concede.
Yeah,
whatever your demands are,
we can't. There's no there. So it's like from their standpoint, the military just kind of looked at it as, like this thing of, all right, well, there's a thing there.
Yeah,
but we're not gonna. And hence, that's why the lawsuits and everything else. These guys aren't telling us everything else. That it's really interesting. But they're choreographing a lot of the way they're pushing the stuff out to the public, even though it seems to be some restraint. It's very weird. But either way, Biden should answer that question. That's my point. Either way, whether it's us, not us, either way, there's something in our skies. There's something flying through our airspace. It's doing stuff that we don't know what it's doing. You're the president of the United States. Your job is to answer that question. Shouldn't be allowed to blow that off. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. Yes, I'm annoyed by that. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So Lula is out of prison. The charges against him from the standpoint of anything that would stop him from running for office again have basically been dropped. And the question is he going to run for office? Now, The Guardian was able to sit down with Lula and have a conversation. It seems like he's running for office in next year's election. He hasn't necessarily said a definitive yes, but it's very clear that considering the number of people that Bolsonaro have killed within the context of his policies, the number or the crisis that Brazil has been facing, you can imagine that Lula's chances starting off are pretty phenomenal, especially considering the information and the fact that he have been railroaded have been made very clear, very publicly. To have a conversation on Lula and his chances in regards to running in the race, we're joined with Shoban Saxena. Shoban is Sao Paulo-based journalist reporting on trade, culture, music, and of course, football. Despite an interest in international issues, human rights, and politics, Saxena's previous position as an editor with the Sunday Times of India and in his current journalism job in Brazil, his works capture the slice of colorful and overlooked lives of regular people in the countries of his interests. Shoban, thank you for joining us, man. We had a hard time. We were playing like phone tag, but thank you for finally getting here and joining us. I appreciate you being here.
Good morning, Jamal. Good morning, Shane. Thanks very much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
No, man, absolutely. Thank you. So I wanted to get into Lula, and I wanted to get into this one for a while. Lula, it's clear at this point that the U.S. had some kind of influence in regards to putting him in prison. It's also clear that the Workers' Family Party, I mean, all of these guys were taking out Rosa. She was taking out in this kind of coup-ish thing. All of these things allowed Bolsonaro to basically take power in the country. Now, at this point, Bolsonaro has killed hundreds of thousands of people in Brazil. The public is fully aware that that is taking place. Lula, I would imagine, is going into this with pretty good chances just in default by in and of itself, considering the stewardship of Bolsonaro. Is that true? I mean, what is the public thinking, and how is the media regarding Lula da Silva at this point, especially in the political space?
Yeah, I think in my opinion, there's no doubt that Lula is going to contest the election, which is slated for October 2022 next year. He hasn't announced his candidature officially, and the only reason he has not announced it because the election has not been notified as yet. So if he announces it, declares his candidacy officially, that will be considered illegal campaign. But if you look at his behavior, all the indications are that he's going to contest. He's traveling across the country. He was in Brasilia 2 weeks back, and there he met political leaders from across the ideological spectrum, from the left, from the center, of course, even some center-right parties. Last week, he had a meeting with the former president, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who represents the right-wing PSDB party. And that meeting got a lot of traction in the media because Fernando Henrique Cardoso was a great opponent of Lula. He was a great supporter of impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. But now he's saying that if there's an election, second round election between Lula and Bolsonaro, he would vote for Lula. So definitely the ground is shifting in Brazilian politics, a big change. Also very important, when Lula was in Brasilia 2 weeks back, he had a meeting with ambassadors of certain countries, including China and Germany and Argentina. And he also was supposed to meet the Russian ambassador. But I think the Brazilian government put pressure on the Russian embassy to get that meeting cancelled. So Lula obviously is right now behaving like a true statesman, a leader of the country, because the current president, Bolsonaro, as you mentioned, is behaving completely irresponsibly. Just yesterday, he did a huge rally, a motorcycle rally of thousands of his supporters without masks on the streets of Rio de Janeiro in the middle of a pandemic which has killed 440,000 Brazilians, millions of cases, every day more than 60,000 new cases, every day more than 2,500 deaths, and that's how the Brazilian president is behaving. So the country is basically has no leadership. Or you can say,
real quick, how is that tenable? Like, how on earth does he remain in power under that situation? I mean, the public has to know. I mean, Brazil is reeling from the COVID crisis at this point, and he is basically still having rallies with the COVID crisis. Like, how is that politically tenable? How does the media regard that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, the media is very critical of him. The mainstream media is very, very critical of the president. What happened yesterday in Rio de Janeiro was in media all over, also on social media, people criticizing him, political parties criticizing him, media pundits criticizing him. But that's how Jair Bolsonaro behaves. I mean, he's only interested in his far-right base, which comprises, let's say, 14 to 15% of the Brazilian population. And he's just keeping him happy by denying the seriousness of the problem, by denying there's a virus in the air, and promoting conglomeration of people. Of course, this is really a disgusting behavior, but under the Brazilian political system, there's no way you can remove a president just like that. I mean, the only way you can remove a president is through impeachment. And it is very important for your listeners to know that right now there's a parliamentary commission in Brasilia, which is investigating into the acts of omission and commission committed by the Bolsonaro government. Top officials, ministers have been summoned to this commission. They've been asked some very tough questions, and the commission will give its submitted reports after some time, maybe after a few weeks or few months, and that report may lead to some kind of action, if not impeachment, against Jair Bolsonaro. That will be up to the judiciary to make a decision. But right now, he's getting away with it, and the country is suffering in a very, very tragic manner.
Shaban, I'm sure you're familiar with the discourse around COVID over the last year plus, specifically along political lines, with the broadly, although there was a reversal from early on, but broadly what it has become is the left defending more lockdown measures and the right sort of opposing mask use at every turn. Again, interestingly enough, at the origins, back last February and early March, I believe it was, the political lines were actually reversed at that point. Before the full implementation of a lockdown and before it was considered to be a necessary threat, necessarily a threat, it was, the political lines were the opposite of what they are now when it comes to COVID response. Anyway, I'm sure you're familiar with those. In the case of the support for Bolsonaro, what arguments are people having about how his government responded to it? In other words, I'm curious to hear how his supporters defend his action or inaction, the things that he's done in that conversation. What does that conversation look like, Siobhan?
I think from the beginning of the pandemic, as he denied the virus, he called it a small flu or it's like a mild cold. He created a false debate between saving lives and saving the economy. He gave this option to Brazilian people. Either you save yourself or you can save the economy. Now, Brazil is not a rich country like the US, but it's not a poor country either. But a lot of Brazilians depend or they work in informal sector. They depend on their daily wages for earnings. They don't have much money. So those people need to work. And Bolsonaro, in a very, very cynical and cunning way, has used that condition of the people to keep the economy open. He has constantly propagated against it. He's been telling people that I'm talking on your behalf, and it's the rich and the middle class who want the lockdown. It's really a perversion of the logic. I mean, in Brazil, as you mentioned, the left, of course, the left governors have supported tough measures, if not lockdown, against the pandemic. But even center-right parties have taken some steps against the pandemic. But Bolsonaro and his supporters have been giving death threats to the governors who wanted to promote social isolation, social distancing. So this is a different kind of a debate here. He's using the poverty of the people, hunger of the people, and the difficult conditions they are to keep the economy open. Of course, the people cannot sit at home for a long time. The solution to that problem was some kind of economic support, as we've seen in U.S. and other countries.
But could Brazil afford that? Could even taking Bolsonaro and his politics and policies out of the equation for a second, what would that do to the Brazilian economy? The kind of support that you saw in some European countries and in some of the states here in the U.S.
Yeah, of course. I think Brazil is a pioneer in direct cash transfer. Actually, the scheme called Bolsa Familia. It was started in Brazil almost 15 years ago when Lula became president, and it was a small amount of cash given to poor people, and that brought tremendous changes in Brazil. So Brazil has a lot of expertise in direct cash transfer. Of course, they have given some money here, almost $150 a month to poor families, but that was given for some time, but that was a major assistance. Yes, Brazil has an economy of about $1.4 trillion and a population of about 220 million people, which is equal to the population of my state in India, actually. The Uttar Pradesh, the biggest state in India. You can imagine an economy not much smaller than the economy of India, but population the size of just one Indian state. So Brazil has the resources. Brazil has been giving billions of dollars in tax cuts to the rich people, to the billionaire class. So if the government wanted, they could have supported the poor people with direct cash assistance. And by not promoting, at least, not forcing them to work when working meant either choosing between life or death.
I'm curious on what would Lula have done? Meaning, let's say for the moment that Lula takes over, what are some of the things that are going to have to change in regards to the next government? I mean, I would imagine with Bolsonaro being in office, he probably had the capabilities of doing all sorts of damage in that particular role as head of the country. What are I guess what I'm getting at is, based on some of the challenges that Brazil are facing, what is Lula, or basically whoever else takes power in the coming election, what are some of the challenges that Brazil is going to have to deal with?
Yeah, I think Lula has clearly spelled out his vision for Brazil at the moment in various interviews that he's given to TV channels and newspapers around the world. And he has basically, he offers three solutions. The first thing he says, a scientific attitude, listen to the science. Bolsonaro has completely ignored science. He says there's no virus. It should not be taken seriously. It's a mild cold. That is first thing. The second thing, vaccination. Brazil is faltering big way in vaccination, despite, again, being a pioneer in the field of vaccination. Brazil is one of the few emerging or developing countries which have a free and universal healthcare system. They have a very sophisticated vaccination program. Brazil has done a lot of vaccination against polio and other diseases, and very successfully. Brazil is a pioneer, a reference point, and it is failing. Second point, Lula says he'll immediately promote vaccination, not just in Brazil, but also in other poor countries, African countries, Asian countries, in Middle East, which are also suffering, which needs vaccines, which are being hoarded by rich countries, by the US and Europeans, and not reaching developing countries. And the third point, he says, direct cash assistance to poor people. Put economy back on the track. Don't put people in a bind where they have to choose between working and living. Of course, you can't shut down an economy. A country, an emerging country economy cannot be shut down completely, but people can be given safe environment to work in. People can be made comfortable. Money can be given directly to women. That was done under the Bolsa Familia scheme in Brazil, the first direct cash transfer scheme anywhere in the world. The money was given to the women of the house so that they could run the house, they can buy food to the people. So this is what Lula is proposing. Listen to the scientists, do vaccination, help the poor people, and give incentive to the economy to come back on track.
Okay, Shaban, thank you for joining us, and thank you for that. With just one sort of thing that came up right at the end there. As far as I know, there was the Alaska Permanent Fund. There have been a couple of other, and I believe quite a bit earlier, experiments with direct cash transfers. Sort of whether it's universal basic income or if it's not the same for every person, just giving them cash directly. And interestingly enough, if you remember, this is a tangent, and I will come back immediately to the actual news that we brought you on to talk about. But the micro loan program, the sort of cash loan program that was touted as a sort of weird charity investment mixture thing, in a lot of the philanthropic circles, that has actually been replaced and sort of outmoded by just a direct cash transfer, which does seem to do a lot more for people. Instead of having to scramble to figure out how to get a business going, which was often what people were, assumed to do with the money, and then how to pay that back immediately. If you just give them the cash, that does quite a bit on its own to not just obviously keep them afloat, but also stimulate the local economy. Anyway, there are plenty of good arguments for that. I think the problem here is if you try to do it with an entire country and for a long period of time, it starts to run up a balance that the government fears it can't pay off, or else, face serious potential inflation. And we may be in a better position, the United States, to handle that than Brazil for a couple of reasons. But again, that's kind of neither here nor there. And I could go much further in Bolsonaro's direction on this. One last thing on vaccines, or at least following up on that. The Sputnik V vaccine that was denied. Basically, Russia had offered their vaccine, the Sputnik V vaccine, the first COVID vaccine to be developed and tested out starting last August. They had offered that to Brazil, and the United States government, under Trump at the time, intervened and basically prevented that from taking place. Is that at all a story in Brazil? How did people talk about that, or is that something reserved for the more alternative news media there? Shaban.
Yeah, this issue of a Sputnik V vaccine has been raised mostly by the alternative media, also to some extent by the mainstream media, and people are really, really outraged.
So it has gotten picked up. That's what I was going for.
No, sorry?
It has gotten picked up by the mainstream media to some extent. It has become a topic of conversation for the general public, and it's known. Is that right?
Yeah, people are talking about it. People are desperate for vaccine. People want to travel to the U.S. to take vaccine. People are really, really desperate for vaccine here. People are breaking lines to get the vaccine here. It's a very dire situation here. So people are, if you talk to the general people, if you listen to the chatter on the social media, people are outraged by the denial of permission to Sputnik V vaccine, because this was the first vaccine ever launched anywhere in the world. And the way the Anvisa, which is the FDA of Brazil, the way they rejected on the basis of some data missing, it is very clear. This is happening either under pressure from the US or because of local politics, because the governors of the northeastern states, which are ruled by the leftist Workers' Party, they had formed a consortium, and they together wanted to take this vaccine directly from Russia. But to do that, they needed permission from Anvisa, the FDA of Brazil, and that permission has been denied on purely technical ground. So there are a lot of anger in the people, actually. because Brazil doesn't have enough doses. People who have got the first dose, they're waiting for the second dose, which is not coming. The vaccines like Pfizer and Moderna are also in short supply here. And here you have a vaccine which is ready, which is being manufactured in Russia and India and can be brought here very, very quickly. But the government is creating all kinds of stumbling blocks to make sure that vaccine is not rolled out. So Brazil is right now a massive tragedy, one tragedy after another. And this is the part of the scheme of the Bolsonaro government to deny the virus, to deny the pandemic, and also deny vaccine to its people. But if you talk to ordinary Brazilians, they'll take any vaccine. And people have faith in Russian technology. Russia has a very sophisticated technology. Russia has a history of producing vaccines. I would take it as Sputnik V any day if I get it. But it's not coming here. It's not being rolled out. A massive tragedy being inflicted on people of Brazil.
Jamarl, question on international politics for the moment. So in many of the countries, whether it was Brazil, whether it was Venezuela, whether it was Honduras or Bolivia, it wasn't successful in Brazil, even though they kept trying to put Juan Guaido in as leader of that country. It was a very weird, but for the most part, many of those countries had this notion of foreign interference in regards to injection into those elections, into the political process. Well, is there any talk or is there any thinking about if those governments get back in power, or if the left gets back in power in those governments, of maintaining that authority or maintaining their capabilities of remaining in office to push back against the coups? For example, like right now in Bolivia, they would have to imagine or think about a process of retaining power, considering they were taking out of power, last year. So it's like, are the left-wing governments that are coming in, are they aware of the shortcomings of their previous administrations, or aware of the weak points that allowed them to be undermined in the first place? Or is there no talk of this? This is just kind of one of those things that may be taking place behind the scenes.
So this cat and mouse game in Latin America and South America has been going on for decades. The U.S. has always considered South America to be its backyard, where they can play the dirty games. This happened in Chile. It happened everywhere. It happened in Brazil with the military coup in 1964, and happened again with the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. We saw in Bolivia a daylight robbery trying to steal the election from Evo Morales. He was made to flee. But there was a massive pushback. What happened in Bolivia is historic. It will have repercussions for a very long time. It was a big victory for the people of Bolivia against open interference by U.S. People like Elon Musk even tweeting about it, that we'll do coup where we want to do. So I think the left is on a comeback, even if not very strongly. They're back in Bolivia. They are back in Argentina. Lula is rising in Brazil again. He's the only leader who was only credible leader in Brazil at the time. And I can definitely say if election happens here today, he'll win in the first round. Venezuela government is still going strong. Elections going to happen in Chile and Peru. There again, left-wing candidates are leading in opinion polls. In Ecuador, they came very close to winning the election. And there's a realization across political spectrum, and mostly among ordinary people, that South America has been a victim for this open interference from America time and again. And
Sean,
I think it's a reflection.
We're going to have to close it there. And I really appreciate you coming on the show. And this was extremely insightful. Like I said, I have been trying to get into Brazilian politics for a while. So definitely, thank you. Shoban Saxena is a Sao Paulo-based journalist reporting on trade, culture, music, and, of course, football. Despite an interest in international issues, human rights, and politics, Saxena ensures in his work that it captures a slice of the colorful and often overlooked lives of regular people in his countries of interest. He has worked with the Times of India, Indian Express, Hindu. He's currently contributor at The Wire and Brazil Wire. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That will strongly insist that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to the headlines. In the news, more than 14,144 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, with about 189 new deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 25,318 cases per day, a decrease of 38% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 39% of the American public has been fully vaccinated, and 49% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected more than 33,137,938 people across the United States and has killed 589,517 human beings. Japan opens massive COVID vaccination centers just 2 months before the start of the Olympics. From my understanding, the vaccinations in Japan are extremely low. Nevertheless, the Olympics are still set to go on. India's COVID death toll has surpassed 300,000, with the country's health ministry recording 4,454 new deaths in the last 24 hours. President Biden decreases infrastructure proposal down from $2.3 to $1.7 trillion, and Republicans still block the 10-year plan. In fact, they made the point of saying they are further away than what they were prior. And what is being called a plane, quote, hijacking or a state hijacking by the KGB, a Ryanair passenger flight was forced to land in Minsk, Belarus, with the Belarusian dissident being taken into custody upon the plane's arrival in the country. The European Union is prepared to take action against Belarus, a country they considered the last dictatorship in Europe. A UN nuclear watchdog said Iran agreed to a 1-month extension of the surveillance cameras installed in its nuclear facilities. Aung Suu Kyi appeared in person court for the first time since her arrest and detention on February 1st earlier this year. Also in appearance was Win Myint, president of the previous government. Taliban launched a fierce assault in eastern Afghanistan, nearly breaching the provincial capital in Medellin city. Mount Nyingango erupted in eastern Congo. At least 15 people are dead, 170 children feared missing, and over 600 homes destroyed. More than 25,000 people are seeking refuge in Sake, DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. After reopening to the public on Tuesday, historic treasures were stolen from Arundel Castle, including rosary beads given to Mary Queen of Scots. They're worth $1.22 million. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So we are still in talks with Iran in order to, I suppose, come back to the JCPOA in some way. These talks are very interesting to me in two ways. One, in the way that the media talks about it, or three ways. The way the media talks about it, the way the Biden administration talks about it, and the reality of the way it is. The reality of it is that we pulled out of the deal. The reality of it is that Joe Biden has nowhere else to go but the deal, because what is the alternative to it? And Iran shows that up by increasing their enrichment, with the U.S. just standing there looking at it, shaking its fist. So you have a situation where the U.S. talks about it in the sense that Iran needs to come back into compliance. The media talks about it basically from the perspective of the Biden administration, even though it may add in the Donald Trump pull out of the deal and everything else. But the reality of it is we pulled out the deal. and that the only thing that's keeping us from going back to the deal is this notion of self, this self-awareness, this not wanting to look weak or not wanting to look like we're the ones that are running back to the deal because we made some kind of mistake. It is a very weird situation. Everybody and their mama knows that Trump pulled out the deal. Everybody and their mama knows, if they just look back over the media for the last year or so, that Iran stayed with the deal for a year afterwards. And so all of these secret talks, oh, they're meeting in Vienna, they're talking, but not themselves talking. It's a group of a group of a group that's kind of related to the uncles of this other group that's talking to Iran. But we can't be caught in a room with these guys. I mean, it's so utterly bizarre. And nobody just asked the question, sir, we pulled out the deal. It seems that you want to get back to the deal. Why don't you just go back to the deal? What's stopping you from just saying, sanctions are gone, we're back to the deal? You don't need anybody else to do it. If that's really what you want, why not? And the answer, honestly, is very straightforward. He doesn't want to look weak. And he knows that the Republicans would chastise and attack him if he did that, despite the fact that that is clearly what he wants to do. And so you see these talks with the European Union and everything else. And it's like, dude, if you really wanted to go back to the deal, you can go back to the deal. And I'll go further. I'm even at the point where I'm not even sure if Biden and the Democrats are going to hold the midterms. When we were talking about this the other day, I was like, yeah, Democrats are going to keep the midterms. Now, the reason I was thinking about that is because if you look at what they're fighting over, Democrats are saying, we want infrastructure. We want to spend trillions of dollars. We want to spend money. Here's the credit card out. Republicans are like, we don't want to do that. And even in this one, Biden gets rid of like, what, $1 billion or $500 million or something? And they're like, or $500 billion. And they're like, yeah, we're further away. We're further away. I come closer to your position and you're like, yeah, I think we're further from where we were before. How am I closer to your position and yet further away? What kind of weird geometry is this? And so it's like Biden is still trying to do the bipartisan thing. If he's going to do that, or he is going to allow a bill that is so minimum and diminutive that it basically cripples any agenda that he's trying to take forward, then he's going to lose it. They're going to attack him on it and say it's too small. It's not enough. It's not what we wanted. It doesn't do what we said he was going to do. And if you don't believe me, look at, what they're doing right now with the Bipartisan Commission for January 6th. They agree to have basically a Republican and a Democrat in the structure of it. Literal bipartisanship. And Republicans are still like, nah, that's not bipartisan. I'm done. They structured it. They set it up together. And they're still like, yeah, that's not bipartisan. I'm done. And so it's like, if your name is Joe Biden, you got to get stuff accomplished. Otherwise, you're going to lose your seats. How do you get it accomplished, though? You're not willing to get rid of the filibuster. You're not willing to push your various members. You may not even have the physical powers to do it. So what do you do? And what have they gotten accomplished? I mean, we're going into the midterms. They got the one bill accomplished that Donald Trump himself was basically going to do himself. Donald Trump was trying to get, what, 1.8 trillion. Biden got 1.9 trillion. Great. If he doesn't get something accomplished, they're going to lose the midterms. And at that point, that presidency is done. And the Republican Party right now is in the mindset that Biden cheated to get in office. And that has been their Republican dogma, that basically there's been a big lie that's been perpetrated across the American public, that Biden won is not won, and Republicans are basically lined up behind their beliefs. And the majority of them believe that. That's the opposition. That is not a recipe for goodness. What are your thoughts? I mean, I think that's horrible.
Yeah, I think that they will lose the midterms. I think that by how things are going right now, who was it? I believe it was Carmine Sabia who said that this was going to be the last big hurrah for the Biden administration when they passed the COVID relief bill, which, like you say, Trump was pushing for too. And I can imagine, right as you were finishing up there, I was just thinking about how Trump is going to be framing this. What his rhetoric, what his talking points are going to be in the run-up to the presidential election. And, they're all kind of obvious. Biden didn't do enough, but what he tried to do was socialist overreach. That's the classic Republican line that I'm sure Trump is going to make quite a bit. And then the Democrats just continued this whole witch hunt mentality thing. Now, maybe this is me putting my bias into it, but this is Trump introduced the phrase witch hunt reintroduced it as a big popular term for what happened to him. I think it's a pretty good one. And that's going to be a valid argument. I mean, the onslaught, tech growing, and it doesn't seem like there's going to be any big antitrust breakup by 2024 specifically, and very doubtfully by 2022. So that's going to still be a talking point. I'm just thinking, okay, what's he going to be saying? And at this point, what can Biden do, and what would Biden do to respond to any of it?
Yeah.
Now, what Biden can do is he can get more legislative packages through. He can get more bills passed, get more big plans out. Right now, though, the bipartisanship thing is really holding him back, and he's not willing to hold anybody's feet to the fire, apparently, to get his version of things through. It's, more moderated, modified packages.
Yeah.
That, I mean, maybe they'll be great.
I mean, he's
or maybe
blown
they
off
won't.
the school stuff. I mean, like, I'm so sick of people using the FDR for Biden. He hasn't done anything. Like, that's the part that's aggravating.
Yeah.
Like, I get that he's talking, and it's like both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party is basically, it's almost as if they acknowledge, okay, somebody raided the Capitol. Something's wrong. And for the last year, regardless of whatever we think the reasons are and everything else, there was protests that was basically burning down police stations. I've never seen that in America. Something's wrong. It's like both parties get it. Neither party wants to do anything in real terms about it. But what they would do is Mitch McConnell will come out and say, this is Trump's party, basically. Lindsey Graham, this is Trump's party. But all of these guys are still neocons. Nothing has fundamentally changed, just this fealty and allegiance to Donald Trump.
Well,
that's what changed.
It's an overgrown empire whose last frame of reference for a successful society was in the 30s or the 40s or something like that, on the upswing from World War II. And then you had this gradual decline, arguably starting in the 50s, maybe the 60s, maybe the 70s. My point is there's no generation of leaders currently in power who have any recent memory of a sort of functional self-image, a good self-image in American society. So when people look for sort of aspirational, role model type figures for a Democrat, they have to go back 80 years practically to get to FDR.
And then don't have the capability of doing what FDR did. Or at the very least doesn't have the guts, I mean, they're using FDR.
And
Biden,
even Trump, just to close up the other side of it, Trump.
Reagan. They keep saying Reagan.
Reagan, but I would say even goes back further. Make America great again. How exactly far back is again? And I'm not saying this is as again a leftist who's like paranoid, all of these rights he's trying to take. I'm just saying, realistically, when is the functional society that he's referring to in this sort of primitive sense in the American imagination? I would argue it's the 50s or something like that.
The 50s, the Eisenhower time period.
Exactly. When we had this sort of cultural, technological optimism and things were getting better and America was doing great, the most powerful nation in the world, and structure, functional families and cheap housing and high wages and the rise of industry.
People can go to school without mass amounts of debt. One family or one income can hold down a house.
Before the whole 60s thing happened and we started to question ourselves and scrutinize ourselves. But seriously, that would be the point that he's referring to. And I guess my point is, you talk about neocons and neoliberals, and I just had this weird internal image of in abstract, our society as this overgrown imperial society where we're literally, who are the politicians, who are the political figures, who are the decision makers? You have neocons and neoliberals. I know this point has been done to death, but they are both sort of revisions of old structures that we're still living off of. Hence the neo. That's my point. We're all referring to stuff that was created 70, 80 years ago, and we're rehashing it endlessly.
Yeah.
Because we don't have some vision of a new order.
It's just strange that this notion of, all right, how do we perfect or how do we make better what we currently have in regards to deviation to move forward? You're right. It's a look back. It's what's the image of FDR? Like, nobody comes out and says, hey, let's do, instead of saying FDR where we expand the number of, let's say jobs or something like that, FDR expanding all the G jobs and everything else. Maybe you do it in somewhat of a different way. Maybe you say, in order for us to get people more so in the mindset of democracy, we're going to make the workplace more democratic. Something. I don't even care what it is. I mean, the breath of fresh air that was Andrew Yang, even if I don't like Andrew Yang, was basically saying this is a system, and the system can be altered and changed for the betterment of the population, and sometimes it grows or outgrows its usefulness in regards to the way it deals with people, and adjustments need to be made. He at least talked about it like that in a way that nobody else did. Like, none of them even get to the deeper questions. It's like, you guys are fighting for $15 an hour. Okay, what happens when they say, okay, $15 an hour, fair enough, that robot is $14.95, and we can save $500 million across all the McDonald's by putting in those robots. So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to cut down on the number of cashiers. We're going to do it over the course of 5 years. They're doing it in Europe right now. The machines are currently in right now. And so it's like those clerks are going to make themselves out of a job. Now, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't push for the 15. It does mean that there needs to be conversation in your society about what that looks like and how do you resolve that, because that's not on the table for conversation or debate. And we're going to smack into that. So it's like talking about the stuff like in terms of FDR misses the fact that you have problems that avail you that are not exactly the same as FDR's, even though they acknowledge it. It's like the very fact that they've changed their ideological utterings gets across that they recognize that something fundamental is off, even if they don't necessarily entirely want to respond to it in real terms. But they've appropriated additional language so that they say, oh, Biden sounds like a lefty. And even on the issue of Israel, Biden wasn't able to maintain a position that Biden typically would have maintained and basically let Israel do what it does. All of this pressure, oh, this guy's an apartheid state, these guys are open air getter, all of that stuff became fair talk in regards to the way the media talked about it and all. Like, so it's like something is shifting, but the political parties aren't there yet. They aren't there yet because they don't, but if you are there, you get rid of the marijuana stuff immediately. You get rid of 50,000 in student debt immediately. You say this is an emergency. 500,000 people have died. We have to do something. That's not what he did. It's something else. It's aggravating, and they're using this bipartisan stuff as an excuse.
But I guess, we got to close because we have Carl Jean on the other side we're going to be talking to. But I'm still very cautious about this government without some process of political reform overplaying its hand and overextending itself and ruining itself because it's too stagnant, it's corrupt, it's too self-serving, and I would say we need political reform. But I make that point all the time, and I don't want to be the dude who's constantly putting salt in somebody's sweet porridge or something.
I mean, it's not a horrible point, right? It's like, okay, you put in a program, and then you have corrupt actors either trying to undermine the program, trying to take money out of the program.
That's what happens. That's what happens. The whole the person you put in charge of it doesn't do a good job. They're there because of a political favor, effectively. They create something that's dysfunctional, that ruins people's perception of what it should be doing. Right. It probably takes quite a bit of money and quite a bit of people's time, etc. It's that idea, it's an overplayed thing. Just the government is inefficient, that whole process. But human society in general is inefficient. Right. Selectively, you have some people and some groups that can get pretty efficient, but by and large, the trend is towards decline unless there's some real progress or some real attempt to make things better, some explicit line of people all trying to make things better. Anyway, and I would argue that's what good governance is about, is keeping good, at least in part, is keeping good people in positions of power, people who will push to make things better. And it seems like we have failed at that. We nevertheless need to go into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we'll be joined by Carl Jha, talking about Myanmar and more. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by Carl Jha, the host of the Silk and Steel podcast, focused on China and surrounding regions in their history, culture, and politics. You can follow Carl on Twitter at Carl Jha, that's ZHA, CARLZHA. Also follow the podcast on Twitter at SteelSilkN, and subscribe to support the podcast at patreon.com/silkandsteel. Carl, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Thank you for inviting me again.
It's great to have you. We're talking about Myanmar, and I will start with the media on this for just a second. Over the past couple of months, since the detainment and subsequent rule, the detainment of the previous government and the subsequent rule of the current military coup government, I've seen the media shift away from using terms like coup or junta, and instead referring more and more to the Suu Kyi government in the past tense. and sort of accept the status quo, accept the reality. Although, of course, many, and I would argue most of the media institutions that are doing this, simultaneously oppose the coup government, and if you were to ask them bluntly, would say so. But things are settling in, is my point. Now, this comes as within the last day, Aung San Suu Kyi made her first in-person appearance in court following virtual meetings for months now. These on charges that were levied against her since her detainment on February 1st over the past couple of months, and effectively, starting with initially ridiculous ones like importing walkie-talkies, and then getting more serious, talking about revealing state secrets. The charges have grown, and it seems that how they go through, how she is charged for the crimes that are being alleged against her, is going to also sort of determine the future of the current government, how it treats the previous administration, whether it tries to reintegrate them, that kind of thing. I guess, though, one baseline thing, should we get used to this, or is this a temporary arrangement, in your opinion, Carl? Is what's going on in Myanmar with the coup government that took over a small number of months ago, February 1st again? Do you see this as permanent? Which side will win?
This is hard to say. Prediction of future is always fraught. But in Myanmar, realistically, the outside forces do not have much power in shaping the Myanmar's future. The Myanmar military junta has always been play an oversized role in the Myanmar politics.
When you say outsized forces, just real quick, you're talking about the United States, China. I'm just trying to clarify briefly there, right?
Yeah, including, China has a non-interference policy, which means, China will not try to interfere in domestic politics of Myanmar. In terms of U.S., there are some more crazier neocon voices that have been calling U.S. to use serve and protect, basically military intervention in Myanmar. But the prospect of that is so slim at this point, especially with the U.S. past failed adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't think American public have much stomach for that, and that's reason why Obama was hesitant to intervene in Syria directly by putting boots on the ground. He did it by proxy, but I don't think any direct U.S. military intervention is in the cards, at least in the immediate future. So with that off the table, there's not much the outside world can do to really shape the political future of Myanmar. They can try sanctions, but remember, since 1988, when the Myanmar military junta cracked down on the protests and avoid the election, the West has placed long-standing sanction on Myanmar until 2000. That did not overthrow military junta. Sanctions. I think the records of sanctions, especially U.S.-led sanctions, speaks for itself. Sanction itself. It caused a lot of hardship, but rarely does it instigate
hit the top and the people at the top of the echelon that they're trying to actually hit in order to change their behaviors.
Exactly.
The People's Defense Force have gotten more strident in their pushback. They're talking about 13 people apparently they've killed recently, and a certain number of people have been detained. What has been the response? I remember the last time you were here, we had the conversation about ethnic groups or ethnic minorities. Some of these groups are very large, their own militaries in and of themselves. Well, it seems that the People's Defense Force have basically started to coalesce into a unit, into a force unto themselves. What is the actual strength of that in regards to pushing back against the military junta?
That's because you were talking about the outside forces. What are the internal? Right. That's Jamarl's question, effectively. What are the internal forces? What would they do?
Right. Just keep in mind, Myanmar has been in a state of civil war since its founding, since 1947. They're separatist ethnic militias on the outskirts, kind of in the borderlands of Myanmar. They had been fighting for their independence for over 70 years by now, and now many of them see the current crisis as an opportunity because in 2008, in preparation for the reconciliation with Aung San Suu Kyi mediated by U.S., the military government of junta, they came out with the 2008 constitution. And then they actually launched a big offensive to kind of strong arm these different ethnic separatists to sign a ceasefire and to sign on to this 2008 constitution. Many of them did, but now there calls for repeal of the 2008 constitution because of the coup, and many these separatist militias are now using this again as an opportunity to continue their fight against the juntas. So that's what we're seeing. A lot of violence on the borderlands of Myanmar, refugee crisis. The refugees, thousands of refugees are fleeing again to neighboring countries like India and China and Bangladesh. But this is really nothing new. It's just more the latest, more intensified phase of the conflict that had plagued Myanmar for 70 years. And the what you mentioned about a new force. In the past, we have seen this in the 1960s when the military junta first consolidated their power. They forced the Communist Party of Myanmar to run to the borderlands to make coalition with these separate military ethnic militias. And that actually, with help of Mao's China back in the 60s and 70s, there was a Myanmar Burmese communist insurgency in northern Myanmar. But that collapsed after China withdrew its support after Deng Xiaoping came to power. So Myanmar, there's like no the political process in Myanmar is a process. You may reach certain points where we see relative peace for a few years, but then inevitably it breaks down, and now we're at basically the latest phase of intensified conflict. That's what we're seeing right now.
I want to come back to the idea of outside intervention for just a second here, because it does seem very likely, very possible, even likely to me at a certain point, either as this conflict continues and if you face the risk of a complete breakdown of the government and secession by many of these, independent ethnic minorities like you're talking about, or whether it just gets more serious. I don't doubt that the U.S., we wouldn't stomach putting boots on the ground, at least all that many at all. But what we could very well do is, pretty predictable, just fund some of these groups, give them arms, that kind of thing to, sort of selectively favor our side. And China, too. I could see China. China has been stretching its limbs slightly after a very long time in a more, you understand what I'm saying, in a more sort of singular and enclosed position or something like that. They've been flexing slightly. This is right on their border, and as we've talked about so many times, it would be a pivotal other trade route for their Belt and Road Initiative. And so there's a propensity that it seems like there's too much at stake between China and the U.S. for this conflict to go unguided, whatever that looks like. And I'm not trying to say that it would be any better if they decided to intervene. A proxy war would probably be the worst thing for the citizens of the country, added on to everything else. But I'm just saying it seems likely. Carl, what's your take?
Yeah, actually, you are right that Myanmar has always been a theater where, there's geopolitical competition between U.S. and China played out. But then again, it's not like U.S. has not intervened in Myanmar before or has ever stopped interfering in Myanmar. I mean, CIA had actively worked with remnant KMT forces. The CIA had actively worked with remnant KMT forces in northern Myanmar throughout 50s, and later armed like separatist militias like the Karens along the Thailand border, of course, with close cooperation with the Thailand military, who have their own, beef with Myanmar. About the China's goal and objective in the region, though, what China really wants to see is it wants to see stability on its border. The last thing it wants to see is tens of thousands of refugees streaming out of Myanmar into Yunnan, the next door Chinese province. In fact, China already seen some, the ripple effects of the coup already, because I have a friend who is teaching on the Myanmar border on the Chinese side. The region actually has fared pretty well under COVID because they had a very rigorous trace and test and trace program. But in the more recent days, because refugees from Myanmar, now there's a COVID outbreak in the region again. So their region is currently under lockdown again. So the last thing China wants to see is political instability on its border.
Well, I know, and refugees are certainly one of the worst sides of that, and clearly there's the deep human cost too. But how would it fare, and how would China feel about a handful of countries replacing Myanmar? Again, if you had these ethnic minority groups breaking away, if it got to that point, that seems like that would up the ante slightly internationally and be more likely to draw in other countries, both from the sort of interventionist, more protectionist perspective of the United States, or from China, which, again, you have suddenly competing countries that could be going to war with each other very quickly. That seems unstable, which from what you said is exactly the opposite of what they want. We got to go to a break, but before we close, just briefly, do you think that would be enough cause for China to decide to intervene, China specifically? Carl?
I don't think China will let it develop to that point. So that is why China recently in UN used its position and veto down the proposal by United States to insert the protect and serve and protect clause. There was a recent vote introduced by the U.S. representative in UN. Basically, you will give a fig leaf to U.S. military intervention in places like Myanmar. And I just want to remind your audience also the ethnic conflict in Myanmar, and the separate ethnic militia, that has been a thing since 1947. So this is nothing new. The interest of China is as much as possible to freeze the conflict, right, and to not to see it flare up too much.
Well,
so I don't
this
think
is why there are claims that China is involved on the side of the military junta. Like Reuters is basically reporting that there were claims that China was working. Let's say, if not necessarily in direct coordination with the junta government, that it was in some way working with, and you made the point that their goal was stability. Well, is a junta on some level stability? I mean, is it true what they're saying?
Well, okay, so there's a long history between Myanmar and China, and that history, the latest phase really started in 1988 when the military junta cracked down on the election that would have put Aung San Suu Kyi's party in power back then, and then because both China and Myanmar were isolated diplomatically in the international space, because China itself in the following year, in 1989, had the Tiananmen Square protests. So China and Myanmar kind of developed their kind of the mutual relationship from that point on. And it's true that China sells weapons to Myanmar. Like the Chinese military has developed its relationship with Myanmar since then, like weapon sales and stuff like that. And that is one thing actually prompted U.S. in early 2000 to reapproach a Myanmar military junta to basically offer them a deal where they would bring in Aung San Suu Kyi into a coalition. In return, the West lifting the sanction on Myanmar. So, but what happened since then is actually under the new under the new Aung San Suu Kyi government, China actually benefited greatly because of the Western sanctions were lifted, because of all these, especially financial sanctions, that China were doing more business than ever before in Myanmar. So what happened with the coup is actually the last thing that China wants to see. China would much rather to return back to the Aung San Suu Kyi days, where it's just doing brisk business without much impediment. And right now, I think from China's perspective, and also, it probably wants to work with the ASEAN countries to urge the military junta to find some kind of solution where they will maybe offer some way, some resolution of the crisis by giving, maybe even giving some power back to Aung San Suu Kyi. This seems very unlikely right now at the moment. But again, this is a developing story, so we'll have to wait and see.
Well, they're talking about nixing her party. Like, they're talking about, like, potentially getting rid of the NLD entirely. Like, so right here, the head of the Myanmar's military-appointed state election commission has said that his agency will consider dissolving Aung San Suu Kyi's former ruling party for its alleged involvement in electoral fraud. Like, this is pretty...
I mean, they're not backing down. The military junta, and neither is opposition. Right now, they're further polarizing the conflict, which is really, like, nobody in the region wants to see that. I mean, because most of the ASEAN and as well as China rather just want to return back to business, the big business as usual. They don't want the conflict to drag on to affect the trading, investment, and potential further Western sanctions.
Yeah, this is like the worst case scenario for this to take place. I want to pivot for a moment. And the voice that you guys are listening to is Carl Jha. He's host of Silk and Steel podcast, focused on China and surrounding regions and their history, culture, and politics. You can follow Carl on Twitter at Carl Jha and his podcast at Steel Silk N. But we're continuing with you. We're just going to skip the break. I want to get into this amazing report that came out about, this was the New York Times, 1958 nuclear weapons that the United States and internally that the U.S. had strongly considered, the military brass was strongly pushing and considering for a nuclear first strike on Chinese mainland if China would have attacked Taiwan. Now, at this point, there was the second, I think it's called the Second Taiwan Strait War or something to that effect, where basically China was bombing the main, the outskirts, the Taiwan Islands. And the question became, well, what happens if China, at this point, the Communist Party decides to take it? What will we do? And there were military that strongly considered nuclear strike. And on top of that, even considered, what would the Soviet Union do? Would the Soviet Union retaliate from the standpoint of nuclear weapons? This is astonishing that these guys were talking about this. How do you view this? Like, what is your take on this? And what do you think the response would have been if they would have went through with this? And more importantly, Daniel Ellsberg released this because his concern was, well, what about now? What is the policy now? Is the policy still nuclear strike in order to protect Taiwan? What are your thoughts on this? I mean, this is astonishing stuff.
Yeah, actually, I like to remind your audience, this is nothing new. MacArthur, back in Korean War, actually proposed to use more than 30 nuclear weapons to drop in Manchuria to basically turn the whole Manchuria into a radioactive lake to stop the Chinese supplies into North Korea, to supply the Chinese volunteer army in North Korea. And MacArthur, of course, was vetoed by Truman. And so the second Taiwan Strait crisis happened a little bit later. It happened around 1958. Yeah. And these are the islands off the coast of China. So they're not even off coast of Taiwan. They're off coast of mainland China. They're like a mile away from major Chinese city of Xiamen. And at the time, there's always a gung-ho faction within the Pentagon right, that advocate use of nukes. And this was 1958, so that was before China had developed its own nuclear weapons. So U.S. thought it could, at least some among the U.S. military brass thought they could use nukes with impunity. Only thing they have to worry about is what will be the Soviet reaction, right? And thankfully, the saner heads in the U.S. government prevail, and that idea was shoved. And again, the Augsburg, the reason Augsburg brought out the story is actually very relevant, because now there's talks among the national security establishment within U.S. that U.S. may not be able to compete with China in conventional arms in a war over Taiwan in the next few years. So and there's also talk about deploying tactical nukes into the Pacific theater. And I like to remind people, U.S. do not have a no first strike policy. China has a no first strike policy, which makes sense because China only has 300 odd nuclear warheads. U.S. never, has a policy of giving up its first strike option, and now some of the crazier folks in Pentagon wants to maybe use tactical nukes to tip the balance of force in U.S. favor, because they felt, okay, well, now that if the Chinese have ballistic missiles that could wipe out a aircraft carrier, guess what? We can up the ante by using tactical nukes. But then the question always, like, what happens next? and I don't think that's been seriously talked about enough in the U.S. media and public space, because now both China and U.S. are nuclear powers, and how do you de-escalate from a nuclear exchange, right? And nobody is talking about this. That's actually the most astonishing thing for me.
Well, and you said in the Western media. How about in the Chinese media?
Nobody really has discussed in the Chinese media what a war would look like, over Taiwan, right? China, for its side, it reserves the option to resolve the Taiwan issue militarily, but they have been saying that since 1949, right? It's been 70 years, and at this point, China does not. There's no immediately need for China to press a military option at the point, especially at the time when China's power is on the rising. Right, everybody can see if the current trend continues, China will replace U.S. as a predominant economic power, and at some point as the
military power too. Totally. And how this would look, you kind of touched on this earlier. We got to go to a break pretty quickly here, but it seemed to me, and I don't want to make too strong of a point with this, but China is in some ways like the United States before World War II, where you have a lot of an industrial capacity. You've been working on that for decades. That's going well. If you were to see a world war, a significant war, World War III, that kind of thing, and it didn't lead pretty quickly to mutual nuclear destruction, what you probably see is China intensely mobilizing industrially to get itself up to sort of full wartime capacity. And I believe that with not just its population, clearly, but with particularly the current government in place, how effective Xi Jinping appears to be at his kind of politics, I could see them industrializing pretty quickly. And you're talking about current trends continuing. Either way, it seems likely for us to see something like that. And then if you add into the mix the idea of Russia getting involved, if it truly became a world war, obviously, other parties would get involved too. It would be a lot of us in that. I can see China coming out with a winning hand. In the end, though, we need to close out this interview. Carl Jha, thank you for joining us. Great conversations this morning.
Thank you.
For those listening, that was Carl Jha, the host of the Silk and Steel podcast that's focused on China and surrounding regions and their history, culture, and politics. You can follow Carl on Twitter at Carl Jha, Carlzha. Follow the podcast on Twitter at SteelSilkN and subscribe to support the podcast at patreon.com/silknsteel. That's the letter N. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are going into a break and we'll be back on the other side. Be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We've been horrified with the rash of videos that have come out of people being shot by police and some of these interactions and how bad these interactions the outcomes of these interactions. Now, we don't take this in a somewhat of a shallow way. We try to get somewhat to the nub of it and ask larger questions around this. Well, specifically, we're talking about Andrew Brown Jr. This is the gentleman that was killed in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, when several officers went to execute a warrant. Brown was sitting in his car. Brown resisted arrest and tried to pull off when one of the officers seemed to step in the path, take a shot in the windshield. One shot hits Brown in the back of the head. Several other hits him in the arm. And the question, of course, is anybody culpable for the death? And was the death legit? Now, this is questions that we've been asking over the course of the last year, especially with the George Floyd killing, but more so in this very specific case. No charges will be filed. Pausatalk District Attorney Andrew Womble announced this week that none of the officers would face charges and said that Brown was using his car as a deadly weapon, steering it towards officers. That apparent danger, even though none was injured, was enough to justify deadly force. We're going to have a conversation about deadly force and officers' use of deadly force. And we have a great expert to have a conversation with us about it. We have Charles Key. He's a former lieutenant for the Baltimore Police Department with over 25 years of experience. He served 10 of those years as commanding officer for firearms training. Charles has written the department's policies on use of lethal force and hostage negotiation and is considered an expert witness in criminal trials. Charles, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Good morning.
Absolutely. So I watched the video for this. A huge amount of the videotape is not necessarily released, but they basically show a section of the tape where it seems that he's in his car. He's trying to escape. And one of the officers seems to step into his path. Now, let's say for the moment, the officer was already in his path, or let's say for the moment he stepped in his path. When is it okay to discharge? Because this seems to be the point of contention. When is it okay for the officer to say, okay, my life is in danger, and I need to, at this point, put this individual down so that person is no longer a danger to myself or to somebody else? When does that moment come? And was that legit in Andy Brown case?
In the Brown case specifically, the moment comes at the point that the individual drives towards the officers, whether he stepped in the path or not, because that's part of what the officers are trying to do. They're trying to effect an arrest on the basis of a warrant. So stopping him that's what their duty is. The point at which it goes from simply trying to stop him to where they're using lethal force is the point at which a reasonable officer, in the circumstances of this case, that is, they have the arrest warrant. As I read it, it was for some sort of drug violations. and at the point he drives the car towards them. As the district attorney says, the car is considered a lethal weapon under those circumstances, and when Mr. Brown did that, then the officers could reasonably believe that their lives or the lives of someone else was in danger. That's one facet. Another is that at the point that he did that, he committed a violent felony, and that is using in this case, a vehicle as an instrument to cause serious injury or death. Then at that point, when he commits a violent felony, the officers are allowed to use, if they have probable cause to believe that he has done that.
Now, does intent
use lethal force to prevent his escape?
Now, does intent matter in any of this? Meaning, if he's I'm just trying to get away, I just want to escape. Does intent?
No,
the intent doesn't matter.
No, because you can't. There's no way the officer can know what his intent is. They can only evaluate what is occurring. So it may have been his intention just merely to escape, but in doing that, you saw the one officer, as he is moving out of the way of the vehicle, he actually was able to reach down and push off the front of the vehicle as the vehicle's coming toward him. So they can't. There's no way that an officer can get into the head of the individual they're dealing with. All they can do is evaluate what is occurring. And the question then is, can a car cause serious injury or death? Absolutely. Can it do that even at low speeds? Absolutely. It weighs maybe 3,000 pounds or so. So the officer then have a reasonable apprehension that this person is actually trying to hurt them.
But if he wanted to hit him with the car, couldn't he have just hit him with the car? If that makes sense.
Actually, the way he was driving, if the one officer hadn't moved out of the way and shoved off the front of the car, he would hit the officer. So again, we cannot get into the head of Mr. Brown as to exactly what he wanted to do. The appearance of what he wanted to do to the objectively reasonable officer is that he's going to escape at any cost, which includes running over a police officer.
And that, like you're saying, that could have happened in this case. But what about the response? Because, and I also want to come back to your use of the phrase reasonable officer and see if there's some sort of legal thing there. You can comment on that too. But is the response necessarily to try to shoot the man, or could you also try to shoot the wheels out on the car, that kind of thing? And I don't even mean I could mean this question in terms of the law, or I could mean it in terms of morals, and I'll leave it to you to sort of pick it up where you will. Should there be a taboo against this kind of response as the immediate response by the police, or is it reasonable in your opinion? And if so, why do you think it is, instead of something that's maybe less likely to work, but also far less likely to end up in the death of somebody? Charles.
Well, the training is they're not to try to shoot to disable the car, because it's a myth that, for instance, if they had shot the tires in this, that would have stopped him. You've seen those pursuits where somebody's on 4 rims, steel rims, and still going. So shooting the tires out wouldn't be an option, and it certainly wouldn't be an option in a situation where the car's within just a few feet of you.
But what if the bullets came after? Like, let's say the car was driving away. And the bullets were fired. I understand
that. I was just answering the other question.
Yeah.
And then when the bullets are at least one shot, according to the news commentary, at least one shot is through the front of the windshield. So an officer is in front of that car at the time that one shot is fired. Then the officer has to evaluate and the standard of objectively reasonable officer does come from the law. It started in 1985 with Tennessee v. Garner in the Supreme Court decision, where the Supreme Court, and the standard comes from the Fourth Amendment, that the use of force is a seizure under the Fourth Amendment, and therefore the evaluation is from the standpoint of the objectively reasonable officer. Tennessee v. Garner was followed up by Graham v. Connor, and there have been a number of Supreme Court decisions since then in which that standard was articulated. Now, back to the question as to the shooting after the car had passed. That's why I indicated that in Tennessee v. Garner, police officers are allowed to use lethal force to stop an individual whom they've had probable cause to, who they have probable cause to believe has committed a violent felony. And in this case, he's still in possession of that car, which was used as from the standpoint of the officers, as a weapon.
Oh, come on. Come on. That's a little thin. That's
That's exactly what the state's attorney said.
No. I'm not saying that you're wrong. What you're saying is exactly right. That's the way that they're saying it. But 13 of the 14 shots came after the car went past. And they're basically saying the car that was trying to escape, fair enough. If you want to say it was a deadly weapon at the time where he was trying to escape and he could have accidentally hit one of the officers, fair enough. And you're right. One of the shots went through the window. That shot was non-fatal. But at the point where the car is leaving and the guy is trying to get away, it is a choice to say that that car is a deadly weapon at that point. That car is a car.
The car, yes, and a screwdriver is a screwdriver until somebody tries to kill you with it. Or a pipe is a pipe until somebody tries to kill you with it.
I know. I guess I'm saying.
In that case, it changes the analysis.
I think the problem here is, and I get there's an argument to be made from the perception that there's a reasonable officer would see the person potentially trying to hurt people with this and be worried that they would try to use it again as a weapon. Whether that's coming back or whether it's just reckless driving is irrelevant to me, but I get the case that you're making. And yet at the same time, they would have to assume that the person was trying to kill them, right, when it seems more likely to me that your average person would simply be trying to escape and get away out of fear, that kind of thing. I want to, we only have a couple minutes left with you. There have been a lot of arguments, almost, in their own way, pretty similar to this argument. Okay, what's the justification for the use of force in this case or in that case? There are all these different ideas in our society about how we're supposed to operate, how the police are supposed to operate, and how we're supposed to respond to them. Do you have any words of advice or even encouragement, anything that you can say that would either help to solidify public opinion in one perspective or another? Obviously, we all have our biases. I have mine. I'm sure you have yours. But what if you had to try to consolidate or solidify that debate, what would you say about it?
I would say that what has to happen is that the police departments have to reach out into the community, educate the community as to what the authority of a police officer is, under what circumstances. Those kinds of programs can help, particularly if it's, let's say, you reach out to the religious community or to community groups that are active in reviewing and or working with police. If you do that, then at least there is the information ahead of time, not post-incident, that under what circumstances police officers can use lethal force. And in this situation, and by the way, I don't have an evaluation as to whether or not their actions were objectively reasonable. That's why I've answered the questions in the way that I have, from the standpoint of the information that I have. So in the end, if police departments will reach out, educate the community, and have the community understand under what circumstances they can use lethal force, perhaps you can cut down on the number of incidents. The other part of it is that the officers, from the standpoint of the departments, the officers have to have consistent, ongoing training as to when and under what circumstances they can use lethal force.
Create a public awareness of how to relate to police officers and what kinds of threats they pose and under what circumstances, and therefore how you should behave if you're dealing with police.
That's exactly right.
And then at the same time, I hear what you're saying. On the police's end too, Charles Key, former lieutenant for the Baltimore Police Department, over 25 years of experience. For 10 of those years, he served as the commanding officer for firearms training. Charles Key has written the department's policies on use of lethal force and hostage negotiation, and he is considered an expert witness in criminal trials, and you can hear it from that conversation. Charles, thank you for joining us. Great conversation and great appearance. We need to close this hour out. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, and we'll be coming back with headlines and the last hour of this morning's show. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show in American news, politics, and events. Well, in our coverage of them. Anyway, from across this divided country and the surface of your increasingly fragmented globe, in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Good morning, everybody. I hope your morning is going well so far, whether you've just started it or you've been with us or yourself for the past few hours. Let's go into the headlines. First up in COVID news, more than 14,144 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday. There were also about 190 new deaths. Over the past week, there has been an average of 25,318 cases per day. That's a decrease of 38% from the average 2 weeks earlier. Almost a 50% decrease from the levels of new cases from 2 weeks ago. 39% of the American public has been fully vaccinated, and 49% of residents have received at least one dose. Almost 50% of people, and that's not just adults, that's all people. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected more than 137,000, but call it 138,000 people across the United States and killed about 589,517 people. Japan is opening mass COVID vaccination centers. This just 2 months before the start of the Summer Olympics. And India's COVID death toll has passed 300,000, with the country's health ministry recording 4,454 new deaths in the last 20 hours. It's been a long time since we've seen those numbers, and I'm hoping that with India's larger population, what we don't see are those numbers jumping into the tens of thousands, which would be, again, a world first, not a good state of affairs, to say the least. So let's hope it doesn't get there. And it now puts, with a 300,000 death toll, India is now in third place in terms of the countries with the highest casualties from this virus. President Biden decreased his infrastructure proposal down from $2.3 to $1.7 trillion as negotiations over the contents and the price tag of that bill continue. Republicans are still blocking the 10-year plan. In international news, and what's being called a plane hijacking by the KGB, a Ryanair passenger flight was forced to land in Minsk, Belarus, with a Belarusian dissident being taken into custody upon the plane's arrival in the country. The EU is preparing to take actions against Belarus under Lukashenko. A UN nuclear watchdog said Iran agreed to a 1-month extension of surveillance cameras installed in its nuclear facilities. And Aung San Suu Kyi appeared in person in court for the first time since her arrest and detention on February 1st earlier this year. Also in appearance was Win Myint, president of the previous government. The Taliban launched a fierce assault in eastern Afghanistan, nearly breaching the provincial capital of Meterlam City. Mount Nyiragongo erupted in eastern Congo. At least 15 are dead, 170 children feared missing, and over 600 homes destroyed. More than 25,000 people are seeking refuge in a nearby town in the Democratic Republic of Congo. After only reopening to the public on Tuesday, historic treasures were stolen from Arundel Castle, including rosary beads given to Mary, Queen of Scots, this in a theft worth over 1.2 million American dollars. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I wonder how much the rosary beads were worth out of that $1.22 million.
Good question.
Because those would be some expensive beads.
We are getting a lot of hatred on my channel.
For what?
Because they say we didn't punch the guy in the eye. That was the cop.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
And they're like, there's not enough pushback. There's not enough pushback. I mean, look, when we have a guest like that on, I don't know the guest. And we have to give the guy the capability of speaking so we even know where he's coming from.
Yeah.
And so it's not a situation within 15 minutes where you filibuster. Like, meaning we're not bringing the guy here to give him a tongue lashing. if that makes sense. It's like, we're going to let you stand in for all of cops and everything that has ever taken place that's bad.
That kind of thing. Okay, so you shouldn't try to keep your emotions out of the conversation. You shouldn't put up with BS.
No.
But at the same time,
he was being honest.
He was being pretty honest, and it wasn't BS.
Yeah.
He was there with maybe one exception that we were talking about over the break, which is, okay, are you really going to consider the cop? Are you really going to consider the car a weapon?
Yeah.
After the person's driving it down the street in a suburban neighborhood. However, I get why he could make that argument, and I didn't want to be insulting, but
it's a ridiculous argument.
Lawyerly to me, it felt like he was being
Well, that's
attorney.
the argument that the cop is making. The cop is making the argument that the car is a weapon. Okay. Now, if I'm looking at that, I can see in the beginning, if a car is driving towards you, okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
And I can even give you the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, in a split second, you're making the choice.
Yeah.
However, if you're firing 13 bullets as the car flees you, and you tell me, well, the car is still a weapon as the car is leaving me, then yeah, I'm going to be like, yeah, dude, that's a stretch. That's rich. Now, they're like, that's insufficient pushback of saying that's rich. Supposedly, I was supposed to say something else to him. Look, my goal in that was to get across how ludicrous it was that a car was a weapon at the point was the car was no longer attacking the officer. And even in the context of intent, his point was intent doesn't matter. Well, from the way the prosecutor is looking at the case, he's right. Intent doesn't matter. So it's like we had the opportunity to push back on him on certain things, but we got to let him talk. And on top of letting him talk, we were able to show that the argument was somewhat ludicrous, at least from my standpoint.
We disagreed at certain points, but I'll be honest, another part of it is just that this killing, is pretty different from the George Floyd one.
It is.
There's a lot more of nuance and ambiguity. And
There's a lot of gray.
I can empathize with the cop in a way that I couldn't in the George Floyd killing, and I couldn't with Derek Chauvin. I can't see myself, and maybe it's just my local frame of self-reference, but I couldn't see myself kneeling on the dude's neck for like 9 minutes.
Yes.
And I can think of
that's so radically out of the bounds of what a person would do.
Whereas you can think, if you're a cop, you're going to execute a warrant, you're trying to get the suspect who's suspected of drug crimes, whatever.
Yeah.
You're trying to do your job, basically. You go there and the dude tries to flee, and you're behind this car that the dude is backing.
Or you're in front, like let's say
exactly. Thank you. In front of this car that the dude is backing up, or trying to drive out of, trying to exit the property. You're going to respond. You're going to shoot. It's just
are you going to shoot?
I think that
maybe
if you have a gun, if you're trying to not just apprehend somebody, but you suddenly feel like you're under threat, like
you
there's
hit the guy
thousands
with the bullet,
of pounds,
and then the car just hits you because you just hit the guy with the bullet and you can't control it. Is it safer to shoot that guy in the car? Like I get it, right? This is kind of like just because something bad happens in the world, the United States has to somehow have a military response. Like a bad deed automatically demands a bad action, and it's the bad deed demands a good war. We think about that. Like, if something happens in Syria, what is the president going to do? The president has a bomb, right? Well, it's kind of like that. It's like, does he? Should he? And I get that it's bad, but like him driving away is bad. Does shooting him make that situation better, either for the cop or for the person? And what I mean by this is, if you hit him and he's driving away, doesn't he lose control the moment that he's hit with the bullet? Is that safer? I guess that's all I'm asking. I get that, okay, the cop is in danger. There's a car coming to me. It's a lethal object now. I need to make a split-second choice. I decide maximum justice. That's what I'm going to do. You shoot once, it misses. The car continues. Are you still amped up? Probably yes. Is your adrenaline still hyped up? Probably yes. You're looking at the car. The car is driving away. You're shooting at the car. In your head, nothing has changed. All of this stuff is happening in split seconds. And it's like, do we want the shot to take place in the first place? I mean, what about shooting at cars as they drive away? Is that okay? Like, all of this stuff comes into play. At the point where the officer is not in danger, is it okay for the officer to continue pressing his assault? That stuff should be asked. Like, I get that the laws say this is fine. But should they say this is fine? Like, that's my question. I mean, the cop that shot the guy, she's been prosecuted. The one where she, instead of pulling the taser, she pulled a gun. And that was the one where you were like, that woman's going to get prosecuted. And I was like, oh, man, I don't know. I was squeamish about it. Yeah, she did. You're right. You're right.
I'm gonna claim that one.
I just kept thinking to myself, that woman might have been baking cookies for the Girl Scouts later on that day. And she pulled the wrong.
She just made a mistake.
Yeah.
It wasn't even a mistake.
It was that.
Yeah,
like,
it wasn't like
she
emotionally made a mistake. It was that she didn't.
She literally just pulled the wrong thing.
She pulled the wrong thing. I hear you on that one. But
it bugged me because I felt like that's not Chauvin.
Totally. But I guess my point was it didn't seem like that person was threatening her in any way.
Right.
And therefore they didn't have the defense that police often do. And at the same time,
But
that
that's the same
seems like
question.
that seems like the definition of manslaughter to me.
But that's the same question
you
with Brown.
accidentally kill somebody.
Where, you know,
well,
it's like,
but no, the argument is that this a cop could have been run over.
I'm saying they are different. I'm just talking about the shooting at the car. Like, she was still going to shoot at the car either way. I mean, she was going to do it with a taser. The other person did it with an actual gun. But I guess I'm asking the shooting at the car thing. I mean, in her case, she wasn't in danger. She wanted to tase him. She shoots him. In the other case, the person is also in the car. The car is in motion. He shoots him. The first bullet, fair game, right? 13 others, not so much. Is shooting at the car okay? I guess that's the question. I mean, if it's a dangerous felon that you think is going to kill somebody, or there's a dead person in the trunk.
So this is the problem, and this is where I guess I can argue this for a little bit. By the way, at the end of the hour, we're going to be taking your calls. If you want to call in on this controversial subject, please bring your topics to mind, 202-521-1320.
Oh, we're going to hear it.
Yeah.
Look, personally, I thought the interview was fine. I loved the fact that the guy
good.
was
He was
on.
good.
And I would love to have him back on.
Yeah.
And
matter of fact, straightforward, good conversation.
Yes.
Good back and forth, I thought.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought so too. I thought he was able to make his point, and I thought we were able to make the point that your basic argument is the car is a weapon. But how is it a weapon when it's leaving the officer? It's that part.
Well, because I mean, I'm reminded of this, not just because, okay, so a car, obviously you can run into people with it, but you are also carrying around gallons and gallons and gallons of gasoline in there. And just for a second, I'm not saying this is extremely relevant, but just as a general thing, that's dangerous. That's an explosive. That's like a lot of explosive that you've got.
How many cars have you seen explode?
Not that many, but my point is you can use it that way. So if you look at the sheer, and think for a second about when can you start driving a car, in a lot of cases, 14, 15, 16, those kinds of ages, it's just interesting to me on a cultural level to note how dangerous cars are compared to, for instance, guns.
Right.
The thing with a gun is there's a sense of remoteness. If you want to kill somebody with a car, you need to literally run them over.
Right.
You need to be in close physical contact, or to use the gasoline. I'm not trying to get too, sadistic here.
Set somebody on fire.
Set somebody or a building or something like that on fire. With a gun, you point and shoot effectively, and there's that level of distance, immediacy, control, all that stuff. But having said that, cars are still dangerous weapons, and so I can understand as a cop, just from the thought of being run.
It's like, oh God, it's going to hit me.
Don't do that. Yeah. I want to stop this threat right now.
Yeah.
And you say one shot, but is one shot enough? It depends on the person. In a lot of cases, it isn't. If you're a big dude or a big woman or whatever, or if you just have a certain kind of body, you get
woman.
shot in a certain place.
Yeah.
That might be less deadly, you could still keep going.
Keep going. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so I don't know where the lines are, and I'm not trying to defend everything, but to add nuance and to add the other side, because what happens is people know a lot of this stuff, and because we know that everybody knows it, we like to leave it out of the conversation. And if somebody starts arguing along one of these lines, we will often assume that they're taking this extreme position on the other side, and we'll attack them. But it's useful to add the actual relevant facts here. The cop doesn't know if they shoot once, if that shoot stuck, if that makes sense, if this person is still a threat. If somebody's trying to kill you and you shoot them and you still see them moving, do you shoot again? Pretty often, if you see them as a big enough
they shoot
threat.
multiple times when they're shooting at somebody, and they shoot center mass.
Yes.
The idea of putting the person down.
Exactly. Not trying to shoot them in the head to.
Yeah, one Biden was like, shoot him in the leg. And it was like, nobody does that.
No, that's too hard to hit.
Yeah, and you can't take the chance.
If you could hit their knee every time, or their leg or whatever.
No issue.
No issue. And that's still pretty brutal, but that's a lot harder to hit than the center of mass, center of their body.
Look, I understand people wanting a cathartic takedown, but cathartic takedown how? I mean, at the end of the day, he's articulating this is what took place based on the elements of the case.
Yeah.
And based on the elements of the case, this is what the prosecutor is saying. And then from our standpoint, it's like, okay, he's just describing what is. All right, so the argument that we're making, or that I'm making, is basically that's ludicrous. And maybe he shouldn't have killed him. And if he did, maybe the law should be changed if it allows it. I mean, the catch is we need to take some level that human beings, for people when they were going after bin Laden in special services, just like in anything else, like if you're playing chess and you got really good at it, you might get bored. You say, okay, well, I'm going to try to beat the computer and get 9 queens. Okay, I'm going to try to do this. Or I'm going to try to play XCOM on Iron Man level at the highest level. And I'm going to, it's that stuff. Because you get bored and you try to play around. Well, same thing's true in jobs. And you had Navy SEALs and some of these guys that were doing these like SEAL team that would do canoeing, where they would try to hit the guy in the head where the head was split in 2 sides and stuff like that. These were games that these guys were playing. It gets pretty grim when you're doing a job like that over and over and over again. And so this human element comes into play where you start shooting. Your adrenaline is going haywire. It's not like cops have magic ability to stop their adrenaline from going. And he shoots. He considers a threat, and he continues to shoot at the threat. I think it's that. Now, the catch becomes, well, is he okay for doing that? Is there something that is human about him doing that, where it's like, look, as a human being, you expect a human being to behave in that way where he can't control himself, et cetera. And is that okay? Like, I mean, I think the first point is it okay to shoot at the car, period? And the answer they're going to say is, well, yeah, if the cop is trying to get hit by the car, is it okay to continue to shoot after? And I think it's a hard argument to make to me that the car is still a weapon when the car is sailing down the street trying to get away from you. Like, that's why I asked him, does intent matter?
But couldn't it have been a self-driving car, Jamarl?
Well, that's the other part, right?
If it's
AI.
like,
car, run!
Exactly.
Get me out of here.
Yeah,
right. There's
exactly.
a program called Run, Evade.
Right. Jinx, you owe me a Coke, Jamarl. Anyway, we need to go out. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be speaking with Mark Sloboda about the situation in Belarus, this hijacking, piracy, whatever you want to call it, with this plane. We're going to be talking again, Mark Sloboda, geopolitical analyst, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Going into a break, coming right back on the other side.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays, when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're joined by Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst. Mark, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Lines.
It is always an honor and a pleasure to have you, and it's always a slight shame when I have to correct myself because it is not morning for you. You're in Moscow, I believe. It's like afternoon, something like 5 p.m. or something your time. Nevertheless,
it's 4:15. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Man, I think it's a daylight savings time. I keep forgetting 7 or 8 hours. Anyway, that's
7 now.
It is 7 now, exactly. Let's talk about Belarus. Lukashenko's government, strongman Lukashenko, has effectively forcefully rerouted a plane, a Ryanair plane, to the capital of Belarus, Minsk. And from that plane, they have detained an individual known as a dissident, a 26-year-old Roman Protasevich, who is one of a number of opposition figures for the country. And I could quibble about the use of the word piracy, for instance, when it comes to this. I get the idea of sort of hijacking an aircraft, relocating it, that kind of thing. But like I said earlier, nothing was stolen. So I don't know, that feels slightly hyperbolic, but technically, legally, I get it probably applies. Nevertheless, this has become a huge international incident. And I want to hear from you, Mark, from what you're seeing in Russia. How big of an incident do you think this is in Belarus? Can you add some context to this in terms of why this specific person was taken? And what do you think this is going to turn into as other countries go ahead with their responses to Lukashenko and Belarus over this? Mark Sloboda.
Okay, so first of all, this is a huge incident. It's going to have all sorts of repercussions for Belarus, for sanctions, for Belarusian airlines. It's going to have repercussions for all sorts of Western aviation flights, which will probably end up avoiding Belarusian airspace now, at least for the short to medium term future. And it's going to, of course, have a very chilling effect on, even more chilling on European Belarusian relations. So it is a big incident. It is being reported in the West as unprecedented, right? It's something that has never happened before. It's some huge escalation. That's all, of course, nonsense. All right. I don't support what happened. I think it was excessive. I think it was, if not illegal, then it was certainly borderline. And I very much doubt that the returns are going to be equal to the international costs that the government in Minsk is going to be forced to suffer for doing this, just for getting this one dissident slash U.S. and European asset, Roman Protasevich.
Yeah, Protasevich.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems so extreme. I mean, you're basically sending a fighter plane to pull down a jet. The Greek Foreign Ministry called
that's not confirmed. That's actually not confirmed.
Okay,
right?
okay, fair enough.
There's a few unconfirmed details. There is some reports actually coming out of Belarus that a MiG-provided escort, Ryanair itself, at the last that I have noticed, did not include any details of that in their report of what happened.
Okay, fair
There are
enough.
also some
Alleged.
reports that a bomb, alleged.
Okay,
There's also
alleged
some
fighter
reports that a bomb threat was involved. That's also not confirmed, and that was Ryanair just referred to they received notification of a security threat on board, and that's why they were forced to land.
Fair
But the point is that this has actually all happened before. There was a flight carrying the Bolivian president Evo Morales that was forced down to land in Austria at U.S. command. They were repeatedly denied airspace travel in Europe in order to search the plane for Edward Snowden because they believed for some reason that he was online. There was a few years ago there was a Ukrainian a flight out of Kiev to Minsk of an international carrier that was forced down at the border because the Ukrainian intelligence service wanted to arrest an anti-Maidan activist.
And yet Europe is acting like this is with outright hysteria.
2012, Turkey, a Syrian passenger plane, Moscow to Syria. 2016, a Aeromexico flight from Paris to Mexico was denied airspace travel by the U.S., forced to land in Montreal because they wanted to arrest someone. So this has actually all happened before, and it's actually been done by Western NATO countries.
That's what Jamarl and I were talking about briefly before the show started. And again, I think this was off air, but and we brought up specifically Snowden. But this seems relatively par for the course for me, and it's interesting to me. But of course, in its own way, makes perfect sense that they would reserve the use of the word piracy for this, but not spare it for that. Anyway, I want to turn to something like something that you hinted at a couple of minutes ago. Lukashenko, why would he do it? You said the cost is pretty darn high diplomatically. This doesn't help his position. I wondered if this was him trying to flex slightly or show strength or something like that, because the figure that he detained and arrested in this case,
like a blogger.
It's a 26-year-old political activist. It doesn't seem like an existential threat to Lukashenko. Mark, what do you think I'm missing here?
Okay, so let's talk about who Roman Protasevich is. All right, so he is a young political activist slash journalist slash Western asset. He got started off in the Youth Front, which is a right-wing, pro-European nationalist and anti-communist movement, political movement in Belarus. Very similar to analogs in Ukraine's Maidan. In fact, Roman was a participant in the Maidan in Ukraine. He did a photo tour of himself participating in the overthrow of the Ukrainian government there. He has previously worked at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the U.S. state media slash propaganda outlet. He's also worked at Euro Radio Belarus, which is a Polish-Lithuanian U.S.-funded analog, specifically targeting. And then he became the editor-in-chief of Next to Live, which is a Telegram channel, also set up by former employees of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And then he became the editor of Belamova, another Telegram channel that is driving the Belarusian pro-Western political opposition. And he's just a number of figures. Stepan Patillo, who is Next to Live's founder, also worked for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Franek Viakorka, who is the advisor to the Western declared real president of Belarus, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Franek also worked for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.
So all of that makes perfect sense. Mark, you're giving effectively the CV of him in the closed network, and I credit you for it because it does make sense why they would want to detain him. And yet, what does that all amount to? Does that all amount to any kind of deep threat to Lukashenko? Or because another way of looking at this is Lukashenko in such a weakened state that he feels the need to respond in this way to keep his hold on power?
Yeah. Or is he that much
right
of a threat?
now, no. Yeah, a year ago, right, or several months ago, yes. Right now, he's actually in a strong position.
It seemed like that.
He is.
Yeah, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who you mentioned, kind of self-proclaimed leader in exile, whatever. She's in exile. She's not in the country, and the protests, although they've come back since the thaw of the winter, aren't too big compared to last year. Let's put it like that.
Yeah. So either he is feeling his strength and is going after each and every last U.S.-backed asset who has been leading the protests against him. He's rooting them out, or what is the possibility for the extreme nature to go to such extreme lengths with repercussions to get him? Was he carrying some type of intelligence that might help expose other networks? Other connections on him at the time? He was flying on a flight to Athens to Vilnius, so he was never supposed to be in Belarus, of course. A Russian girlfriend was actually on the flight with him, who was a student at Vilnius University, and she was detained along with him. And it seems there might have also been a number of intelligence agents, either from Belarus or possibly from Russia, on the flight at the time that may have gotten off in Minsk along with him. They might have been, undercover escort for him, which means this was a very planned means to get him.
So, this is rather extreme. I was looking at the commentary from the various sources. The Greek media foreign ministry called it a state hijacking. Prime Minister of Poland called it an act of state terrorism. Germany's foreign minister said it was, quote, such an act cannot remain without clear consequences, unquote. So what are those consequences? From Lukashenko's point of view, they tried to take him out of office. And so it's possible that he is looking at this like, okay, these were people that were responsible for it. It just seems like the consequences on this are going to be far, far larger than the individual act of getting this person.
I don't think Roman himself was that important that necessitated Lukashenko to go to this length. Right. I can't imagine. I wouldn't say that Lukashenko always acts in a completely rational or logical manner. We have to remember that just a year ago, he was flirting with the U.S. and the West, trying to get leverage in his deals with Russia, and was buying U.S. oil in deals arranged by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He has a habit. He's a creature who, is always trying to maneuver for his own advantage, but doesn't necessarily do the most rational or logical things. Maybe he's got some reason. Again, maybe there's some extenuating circumstances we don't know about. But in my mind, this was an act that was unnecessary, was too extreme, not worth getting. I understand that he doesn't like Roman. I understand why, but I don't think it was worth going to this extreme and the repercussions. It's going to be more sanctions on Belarus, more Belarusian officials who would have been involved in this. Not that that matters to them, of course, at this point, but it will also mean more sanctions. It's actually going to be very disruptive in flights between Russia, Minsk, and Ukraine now, which of course are three very well-connected countries, because Ukraine has already banned flights from Moscow, and Minsk was being used as a hub, and there's already indications that the U.S.-backed Kiev regime will also take flight measures, preventing flights from Belarus, which makes it hard to see how flights are now going to get back and forth between Kiev and Moscow. So it will be a major disruption in travel in this part of the world.
That seems like an inconvenience and also symbolic, but the sanctions and what they would do, the thing is, I thought that the EU had levied, was about sanctioned out. But I'm probably completely wrong. But I'm very likely conflating to some degree the extent of the United States sanctions on Russia, which we often speak with you about. It seems like if we have faux countries and we're going to use sanctions as a tool, it seems like we would have used quite a few of them by now, and that would apply to the EU as well. Mark.
But the U.S. and the EU really has no other means to express their outrage, and that is a domestic and an international political requirement. So it is undoubted that there will be a slew of sanctions.
That's what they've threatened. That's what the EU has threatened.
However effective they actually are.
They could just insult them. I think that would serve the same purpose and require much less paper. But Mark, I think Jamarl, actually, you had a question. Oh, I think you wanted to hit the sanctions.
He answered. Because I was curious about, it's like, what is going to be the response? Like, and is the response going to be of sufficient worth that would create a disincentive for him to do something like this? I mean, because I don't believe for a moment that he thought that the world community was just going to give it a pass. And so it's like, all right, well, either he believes that what is going to take place on the other side of that means less, or he didn't estimate what they thought was going to take place. I don't necessarily believe a world leader would go into it without some level of estimation in regards to what the world was going to do in response. So it becomes, are the sanctions effective in any particular way that would incentivize or disincentivize behavior?
It seems like defiant belligerence. It seems emotionally, I was like, okay, is this more paranoia or is this more sort of anger and I'm going to show you and do what I want to? It seems more the latter, and that seems to be more the personality archetype that would get you into Lukashenko's position and keep you in power for almost 3 decades at this point. Mark, we've got to close. And Jamarl, I kind of cut into you there.
Oh, no, you're fine.
But,
you're fine.
And Mark, any last words here?
No, I think you nailed it on the head. Lukashenko has been a problematic creature for both Moscow in the West for a long time. And he's kind of affectionately or unaffectionately known as Uncle.
That's affectionate.
Here.
I would argue that's affectionate, but also maybe dismissive.
It is.
It's a little both.
Yeah. Mark, we got to close here. Thank you for joining us. Great conversation.
Thanks for having me.
And that was Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst. You can follow him on Twitter, and you should, at MarkSloboda1, and find him on Facebook at Facebook.com/Gramsci. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Going into a break, coming back on the other side. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Every day we ask questions.
How is Facebook going to prevent suicides?
Well, do you see this as being a human rights violation?
Are the cows really stinking up the planet that much?
To move ideas forward.
A gravitational wave is a ripple in the fabric of space and time.
I don't think the launch of the satellite proves anything at all.
Where do good ideas come from? We connect with independent thinkers, hear their ideas, and create stimulating debates on real issues.
The Dow is in a correction. As I said, commodities across the globe are collapsing. Why is that the case? Because we are in a global recession.
That is set to change because Iran has approximately about 50 million barrels, which it had put in storage during the height of the sanctions regime, and that's ready to be released as soon as possible.
Where is the money?
The super rich individuals and the world's biggest companies are able to hide money in tax havens.
Is there a solution to the crisis?
No, because I don't think anything useful has come out of any of the policy reform discussions with respect to financial reform.
They give us answers we aren't always prepared for.
What are the chances that the report would make the Israeli authorities to review their policies towards the Palestinians?
Oh, probably zero.
This recession will be even worse than it was in 2008.
But that would be the nasty way for it to happen, you know. But because of Guantanamo, the U.S. is no longer taking so many prisoners, so instead of taking prisoners, they kill people.
A lot of people think that he's now unelectable and a bad leader.
Wow, there's just so much information to take in.
Pay attention, there'll be a test on this later.
Taking notes.
Welcome to the show.
Wow. This is crazy. We're definitely talking sci-fi over here. From 20 years ago, people would never have believed this. Crazy times we're living in.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around this story. This is a fantastic story.
Yes, it is a fantastic story, and it's a worldwide problem.
Welcome to the party.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Shane and I were sitting here talking about the COVID issue. So the Wall Street Journal just came out with an article. 3 researchers from China's Wuhan Institute of Virology became sick enough in November 2019 that they sought hospital care, according to previously undisclosed U.S. intelligence. Now, the report is interesting because initially when we were having this conversation about it, I think it was last year, people was like, oh, that's crazy talk. That's crazy talk. And they would wave their arms just like I'm waving now. You guys can't see it, but I'm waving my arms now. That's crazy talk.
I've been talking about it for a long time.
You've been talking about it for a long time?
I have.
But it came out of the lab.
On the show. And I brought it up a couple of times. Mojang miners incident. There are different events here that, I don't want to push it too strongly because I don't know and I don't want to claim something that I have no real expert knowledge on. But yeah.
And there are times where
we've had conversations about it.
Well, we've had conversations, but it's hard to differentiate between whether it is media attacking China for some kind of geopolitical thing or whether it's a real there to it. And so I don't necessarily want to jump on the bandwagon of, there's a there to it. China was putting people on airplanes and dropping them off in America in order to get people infected.
Which was what Trump was
that was Trump was saying, right? That's what Trump was saying. So I don't want to necessarily go there. By the same token, I can't necessarily take this perspective that I have God's knowledge that it can't happen. And if you were looking at history over the course of 100 years, will there be a leak or will there be some kind of outbreak from a facility within that 100 years? Well, you would probably say, well, yeah, on whatever particular day, on any random day, it may be a low chance, but will it particularly happen? And could it have happened here? Yes. And so there was the report that came out recently, I think it was from the scientists, atomic scientists, basically saying that, look, we don't have the intermediary animal for the jump, meaning we're missing that part. We don't entirely know. They're just kind of estimating that it's come from this particular area or this particular market. We don't know that as a fact. And a lot of these things are basically conjecture that they're using to dismiss the idea that it's coming from some particular lab. Now, that in and of itself is interesting, that the U.S. wasn't using that as a way of hitting China. And that's curious in and of itself. Maybe this has to do with researchers from all around the world put their money into the various labs to study this stuff. And so the mistake might not have been China in and of itself. Either way, I guess the point that I'm making here is this is now on the pages of the Wall Street Journal and will be something that people are going to discuss. And Shane asks the pertinent question. If it is indeed shown, proof positive, this guy got sick. This guy had COVID.
Who worked at the lab.
Right. This guy worked at the lab. They spread it. And then they tried to lie about it and cover it up.
And the Chinese government is who you're talking about with they. Yeah, right. If the Chinese government tries to cover it up, what's the question then? How do you respond to it?
Yeah, how do you respond as a world? And, does this create world oversight in regards to these type of viruses? And are the countries going to agree to come under that world oversight? Meaning, even if China says, you know what, we need to have a world body on stuff like this to make sure that there's standards across the world in dealing with this.
Yeah.
Will the other countries bring into alignment and bring their stockpiles into alignment? I don't think the U.S. would do that.
But what's the argument against it?
I mean, what's the argument against nuclear weapons treaties or weapons and space treaties?
I think there's a different dynamic here to some extent.
Is it?
Yeah. Okay, so imagine how many countries are you going to have in this consortium? If one of those countries turns rogue state and you leave the biological weapons, which is what this stuff would be, at their disposal, maybe they have, local research sites because you've tried to make this a truly global effort, that kind of thing.
Well, it's weapons and it's checking out human resistance to various pathogens. So, like, how do we deal with this?
Well, but a lot of what's alleged here is that as gain of function research, specifically trying to augment how the virus is,
exactly,
could be variants.
Make it more potent.
Yeah, make it more potent.
This has been
make
a
it
weird
active
virus.
Yeah, that's the point. It's like you're sort of scouting the defensive territory. And I'll put it like this. I've heard it. There's a good quote. The cost of destroying the world goes down by about one IQ point every year.
Yeah.
In other words, maybe right now you have to be like a genius beyond all imagination, 300 IQ or something like that, 1,000 IQ, whatever. But in 100 years, 200 years, or even 20, 10, it gets easier and easier. Exactly. Yeah. You have forces working on both sides. You have sort of more protective powers, if you think about it abstractly, in civilization, whether it's governance, technological oversight, more ways to communicate problems, those kinds of things. But all of those, of course, come with their bottlenecks or their loopholes or their problems, their shadow side, to be extremely silly about it. But the idea is it gets easier. It's also like in encryption and decryption. The adversary usually has an advantage in cybersecurity because they can poke around and do what they want to, whereas the defender is always having to sort of predict them and respond to them.
And you don't even know they're there always. Like you don't know who's trying to get your system.
Yeah.
Like I'm sitting there thinking, all right, I'm going to raid that place. Well, you don't know. I'm thinking that.
Well, and here's where I'm bringing it back. Biotech.
Yeah.
It is getting a lot easier. If I wanted to sit down and do gain of function research offensively, if I wanted to create a weapon, it is getting easier and easier as we develop more and more tools, and the cost for getting them goes down. And the fields.
Basement.
What'd you say?
You can go into your basement.
At some point soon, probably, depending on some of the stuff we're talking about. So the point is you want the prevention as well. You want to have a way. This is actually one of the more interesting of the existential risks. If you look up existential risk, not just a term we use to refer to somebody like Lukashenko as he faces a political crisis, but it also existential risk, existential threats. If you literally look that up, you will see that there is a class of existential risks or threats for humanity as a whole. That people's mind often goes to things like meteor strikes, but you can include on that list particularly virulent and deadly pathogens, certain kinds of environmental or global climate collapse. You can include a rogue AI, something like that. There are all these different ways in which we predict things could just fall apart and we could all die of something, my point. And a pandemic like, not like this one, but far worse, could be one of those. Because it's also, these things are not just likely to occur in isolation, they're likely to overlap to some extent. So you could have, in the same century, a pandemic, an ecological catastrophe, and an unprecedented political crisis all coinciding, which some people say is happening right now. Or it could be something completely unpredictable. My point is, these things exist, and if you want to respond to them, you kind of need to respond to each one in its own way. But with biotech stuff, you do want to do preparative research, like gain of function research, to try to scout out the available territory, what things people can create and how to respond to them. Creating the vaccines before you have the illness itself, that idea. Because what's the alternative? The alternative is that at some point, pretty soon probably, somebody creates their own. Biotech research and production and all that stuff is getting easier and cheaper, like we were just talking about.
You're blindsided.
Exactly.
I mean, I don't necessarily think you want that. I mean, the question becomes, what were the processes in play to prevent this from ever hitting on the world? And I mean, it's weird. I mean, like, a lot of times we were talking about how strange and bizarre it was that people would have symptoms after, the way that it seemed to create this kind of weird anomaly with inflammation within the body, where people would have all of these anomalous symptoms that was associated with it. It didn't come across as purely a bronchial type thing. It was like an entire body reaction. And even the brain fogginess after the fact, it just seems like it responded in a way that was somewhat different. It's just very strange in the way that the physiology of the virus, even in the speed at which the mutations were occurring and the way they were mutating, all this stuff was strange. And so, look, on some level, we deployed science and technology in the moment, which on some level is pretty profound.
It's cool in its own way. We like 49% partial vaccination rate as of this morning, almost 50% of the way over there.
Yeah.
And we're still early in the swing of this on this, the scale of pandemics we're used to.
Yeah.
In less than a year, you have a suite of tools you can use to respond to it and the vaccination for it that's being widely used in a lot of countries, that kind of thing. That's actually objectively, compared to what we've done before, that's pretty impressive.
And just imagine what else it's going to be used for. I mean, we're calling it a vaccine. It's not really a vaccine. It's a messenger that turns into a vaccine.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to be for all sorts of medical illnesses and everything else. That's like, I am really enamored by that, because it's, when they start deploying this and say, okay, go build and do this, and your cell says, okay. Like, you start thinking of, at that point, it's getting the configuration right so the cell can understand what is taking place to accommodate whatever is taking place. But that's that gives you almost like a basis of operation to begin understanding and starting to go into the technology. And if they can do vaccines that fast, I mean, how long did it take to do vaccines prior? And they built this within the course of like a few months.
Yeah.
I mean, they just were testing it most of the time, but the building of it was already there.
And we need to go into our break so we can take calls. But another part of this whole problem, of course, is you have two opposite trends in society that are both right in their own ways. One wants to get help as soon as possible because the earlier you try to, cut down the virus as it spreads, the more impact you're going to have. Far fewer. If all of our COVID response had been the same, but the globe as a whole had started a month earlier, you would have had tremendously fewer deaths. It's hard to overstate that, partly because I believe that we would have been able to get the curve down before this cold and flu season, which was the largest wave in a lot of countries that got hit, and was that way because it had been allowed to spread through much of the previous year, and therefore you had the room for circulation in a season where you have more of that. So that's thing one. But then, of course, pushing in the exact opposite direction, you have people who don't want to experiment too much and who really have good reason for not liking some of the privacy invasions that you've seen. But these parties are both pushing at complete cross purposes, and they both have decent reasons for thinking a lot of what they're thinking. And then in the middle, trying to mediate the implicit differences between what these two groups would want, you have a bumbling government which manages to empower some people to get the vaccines created, rolled out, and those are a success. And if you look at it, it's actually a fairly small chain of sort of command and innovation in terms of what's required to do it, until of course you get to the hospitals and that wide deployment. But in terms of developing the vaccines, it's only a small handful of people. Anyway, you have in the government in between trying to manage everything, and then it fails because it's trying to obey these two completely cross-purpose groups of people who both have decent points. I'm probably more towards the let's go faster side of things, but for the people who are worried about too much, too fast, and who are worried about all of the crazy things that have happened, the lockdowns and the vaccine passports and what New York is doing and the vaccines themselves, all that stuff, I get it. We need to go to a break, though.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is fast. Anyway, Jamarl, you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking your calls. We got two on the line and room for more. 202-521-1320. When we come back from this break, we'll be with you again. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, thanks for the call. What's on your mind?
How you guys doing? First of all, free drilling science. For the past 6 months, I've been following what's been going on in West Papua New Guinea and how the government of Indonesia is ruling that nation, taking out the wealth from the people, the original inhabitants of there that have been there for tens of thousands of years, and they're fighting for their freedom, doing protests and whatnot. We have a company named Freeport McMoran have the contract to mine for the gold in the copper. Got the largest gold mine in the world in West Papua New Guinea and the third largest copper mine in West Papua New Guinea. And the people's fighting for their freedom. We need to put more attention on that and stop the abuse against the natives that's there. Not too many people was talking about it because you got the U.S. and NATO, something to do with Europe and U.S. with mining and strategic metals and all that. But and also you have a bill. I think it's HR 921. But what's his name? Elsenberg? No, forgot his name. He was talking about the Taiwan crisis that they wanted to bomb in 1958. Well, they got to
Daniel Ellsberg.
Daniel Ellsberg. They got to act this out to stop the U.S. from doing first strike. And my last comment is dealing with y'all need to have my opinion is I hope y'all can have Stephen Dunzer on again. I'm not pronouncing the name correctly.
I know you're talking about
correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Y'all need to have him on again, or if y'all didn't, y'all need to have him on. I would love to call and speak to him. I emailed him last night in support and also talking about my case. And also, I'm going to call him today. I donated to him. I think people should donate to this man, too, because ain't nowhere in the world a private security. He was on the Jaws Gallery show yesterday, by the way, everyone. But ain't nowhere in the world a private law firm should get a judge to put him over a house arrest because he won a case like in a country for $9 billion against Chevron. And so they went after this man, and they got him, in the house for, almost, 2 years now? This is insane. He got to be freed, and that judge need to come out an investigation, and everybody else involved with that. And the people, the inhabitants of that region, in Ecuador, I think it is, need to get their $9 billion. Chevron just packed up and left and took the $9 billion from them. So I won't be buying no gas from Chevron anytime soon. I'm going to try not to, but man.
Yeah, that case.
Yeah, that's all I want to say.
Yeah, Tarif, that case is astonishing. So 650 days on house arrest, Steve Dalzinger, an environmental attorney who helped win a multi-billion-dollar case against Chevron for contamination of oil drilling in Ecuador. Now, they've put him in this kind of weird legal quagmire where they've gone after him. It's very strange. Dalzinger told Intercept, my lawyers said you'd be crazy to testify, so we decided to cut the case short. No need to continue to legitimize what is essentially a charade. Yeah, it's very weird. I would love to get this guy on. I've been watching this case for a while now, thinking to myself, this is utterly and entirely unacceptable. I mean, they basically went after him and had him, meaning using the legal device in order to go after somebody that had got you on a case where you basically had to pay billions of dollars. Yeah, it's very strange and it's very weird. So yeah, Tarif, thank you for that. Go for it.
202-521-1320. Also, talking about Western New Guinea, Tarif, that's a rare and good news recommendation. that feels like, I don't know, I'm probably missing some stuff, but that feels like that's coming out of nowhere, but it's interesting. Just reading up on that while you were talking about that stuff. Anyway, 202-521-1320. We have calling us now Michael from Sydney, talking about dystopia, also the Andrew Brown shooting. Michael, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hi guys. I caught the first section of the show and I watched the rest of it. And you're talking about the sort of dystopian future and how it created a very fertile ground for writing. Well, sort of the way I sort of look at it is, the people who are writing about dystopian futures were probably living in a dystopian present. And the only safe way to write about it was to project it into the future.
Yeah.
So, you look at 1984, you look at Animal Farm, you look at Brave New World. I mean, they're pretty much the current realities we live in now, and they're pretty much the current realities of the time that, they lived in at the time as well.
Have they gotten more that way, though?
Sorry?
Have they gotten more that way?
Yeah, they have. I mean, obviously, they took it from a logical beginning and extended it, outwards, and we're sort of reaching a logical conclusion, which is sort of some type of dystopian counter-revolution, I suppose.
And it's unfortunate.
I don't see it as so linear.
I'm sort of thinking of writing a book. It's 1980. It's a Brave New World in 1984 on the Animal Farm, because I sort of think we're living in the intersection of Brave New World 1984 and the Animal Farm.
I agree with you guys, but I would say.
Except that.
Well, I agree with both of you.
I don't think they're necessarily getting better. I mean, getting worse in every way. I don't think that it's
Como.
I don't think that dystopia is the natural endpoint of this stuff, I guess, is where I'd put that.
Well, I think it's where we put our focus on some level. Like you can be in a horrible situation and you can project yourself out in a horrible situation. In X number of years, it's only going to get worse, or in X number of years, this is going to take place. And you say, okay, I can kind of see how we get there. But you can also take the secondary glance and say, well, what if it didn't get that way? What if there were things in a society that were recuperative, that had these capabilities of having emancipatory future? What if? And in the context of that, being able to set a conception and a point of view for something that society to hang on to latch on to. Yes, the present is horrendous. But what happens when you can set that standard of something that's a little bit higher than where you are? I think you set a standard for yourself. I think you do that with art. I think you do that with literature. I think that's why some level art tends to be subversive of current systems and models. And I think that's what Star Trek was. I think when you get somewhere, you can have like a Star Wars where, okay, I'm projecting the war out into the galaxy. You can have something like Expanse, where it's like, okay, we're going to take capitalism out into space, and what does it look like when Mars and Earth get into a war, that type of stuff. But you can also say, what happens if we get our stuff together? You were just talking when we started the show in this kind of euphoric terms of what can man in this world be? What can reality be? Like having that conversation, what happens when humanity rips off the shackles of this notion of subordination or using these people as robots, and people start getting into the mindset of self-improvement, and the point and the goal is not necessarily profit, but how can I make myself the best version of myself? And we have a society that furnishes that. That helps you out to do that.
It's too linear. I guess, I mean...
It doesn't have to be linear. We're talking about something that crashes horrendously before society works
well, but
itself.
That's still a line. I guess what I mean is I don't feel like things are continuously getting better or continuously getting worse. I don't feel like the world works like that.
Like it goes in a direction towards something.
Well, the direction that it goes is towards time. If I wanted to get technical, if there is an asymmetry on a deep physical level, it's in time. But that's almost too esoteric. But
yeah,
what the fundamental asymmetry is time. It's not something like justice. It's not that the universe continuously gets more just as time goes on. Right. Entropy may increase, which I'm almost joking with myself now, which may mean in some sense that justice spreads throughout the universe, but that's only the position of particles. We're not talking moral affairs here. And there's nothing about our world. There's nothing about our civilization that it seems like the way things work is in cycles. It's not in a single lifeline. It seems like you have societies and civilizations as a whole that come and go, and different, it's not even that there's always necessarily been, there hasn't been one humanity. We competed with the Neanderthals at some point. Right. Human nature itself sort of bifurcates and merges as different societies grow up. Anyway, this is too philosophical, and I don't want to go on for too long because we've got calls. But my point is, it's not just the case that the world is getting better or that the world is getting worse. But I agree with you, Michael, calling in from Sydney. We see a lot of 1984, Brave New World, and Animal Farm in the society we're living in. Those are pretty recent and pretty accurate books in their own way. We got more calls. Anthony calling in from Detroit. Anthony, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey, what's up? Good morning, guys. Glad to be on. Thanks for having me. I just was interested in the Andrew Brown discussion and wanted to go ahead and throw a comment into the mix about you see in my opinion, I think you see a similar phenomenon as occurs when discussing climate change, and how to even discuss it lends this implicit validity to the other side of the argument, the idea that there is no anthropogenic climate change and everything of this nature. To discuss this incident removed from the context, the greater context of the white supremacist police state, removes the onus of of that state itself, because when you do so, you're looking at the actions, you're looking at it as something that is to a degree normal and expected to occur, rather than as a result of the structures of that police state. And so you're
basically ripped out of context. It's just looking at it as if it's its own thing that's happening, separate and distinct from everything else.
But how can you consider it as a thing itself without viewing it in those terms? And again, this is like epistemology on some level, but if you're going to talk about it, we're going to be referring to it as an it. And it seems like there are white supremacist states and then there are white supremacist states. You can live in a state run by the Nazis that avows an Aryan race that they say is superior to all others, or you can live in a society like ours that is sort of casually racist in these institutional ways. But there's a mile of difference between the two of those states, and yet we use the same term to define them. Anthony, should we?
I think the result, the key thing between the two is that you're looking at the end result, which is the death of a particular sect of the population, and that's what remains important. So that's why when you determine the causality that's behind the chain of events, first and foremost comes the actions of the state, which have set up this institution, which leads for you to actually, you expect it, but you also expect this to occur because this is what keeps occurring. And it's a cliche repetition of the chain of events being looked at scrupulously on an individualistic level rather than a broader stroke. And
wait, I just want to be real clear. We got to go to a break, and I'm sorry, we're not going to have time to get to the caller after you. But Anthony, you're saying because we can predict that black people will die more often than white people in our society, that's how we know it's white supremacy. basically.
Well, no, I can literally point to white racists and legislation written by them in Congress throughout the entirety of American history, and liberals and such forth co-signing it and accepting it, to a broad degree. Like it's
all right, we got to Anthony. There's a lot more to talk about here, and we got to close the show out. Interesting conversation to have at some point, though. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. First show of the week. We'll be back tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Eastern. Signing off. See you on the other side.